Before there was empire, before there was marble, before the first spear was lifted in conquest, there was a whisper, a stirring beneath the soil, where time itself seemed to sleep, waiting for a name to awaken it. They say Rome began with twins, but not just any twins. Romulus and Remus were born of violence and prophecy, suckled by a wolf and cradled by the wild. To call it myth is not to dismiss it, but to understand that a civilization must first dream itself into being. And in this dream, blood is thicker than destiny. Beneath the Palatine Hill, in a cave later named the Lupercal, the story begins not with triumph, but with abandonment. The infants, heirs to a throne usurped, cast adrift by royal fear, found not death but rebirth in the jaws of a beast. The she-wolf, fierce, maternal, mythic, becomes the first mother of Rome. Her milk is more than sustenance, it is initiation. Rome drinks survival. Rome drinks wildness. Rome drinks defiance. The first soil of the city was not tilled by peace. It was marked by fratricide. Romulus kills Remus. Not for greed, not for conquest, but for the line, for the wall, for the right to draw a boundary that would define a city, and thus begin a civilization. A murder, yes, but more a ritual sacrifice, echoing with unsettling clarity through every founding that followed. To build, Rome must destroy, even its own. Let the silence linger. A city whose myth begins in exile and blood will never truly be at rest, and perhaps it was never meant to be. The first Romans are not Romans. They are outcasts, fugitives, men with blood on their hands and fire in their bellies. Romulus opens his gates to them, criminals, slaves, wanderers, and makes of them a people. This is not democracy. This is alchemy. Rome is forged from the refuse of other worlds, and in this strange alloy, something dangerous and immortal takes shape. The Saban women are taken, stolen in a calculated act of statecraft disguised as celebration. Their abduction is not just a crime, it is policy. It is propagation. The body politic literalized, but it is the aftermath that reveals something deeper. The Sabine women, in time, intervene between their fathers and their captors. They become the bridge, the wound, and the healing. In that gesture, Rome absorbs contradiction into identity. Violence becomes kinship. Theft becomes heritage. Thus begins the pattern. Rome expands not just by conquest, but by incorporation. It consumes, it adapts, it survives. The wolf's milk never leaves its breath. And still, beneath the forum, beneath the triumphal arches and broken colonnades, the older voices murmur. The myth is sediment, a story layered like ash, each epoch built atop the embers of the last. What is a city, really? Is it stone, streets, citizens, or is it something more elusive, a rhythm of desire, fear, and memory? In Rome's case, perhaps it is a hunger to exist not just in time but through it, to defy death by becoming story. Even in its infancy, Rome understood something profound to last. One must be told. So it told itself as legend, not to obscure the truth, but to become larger than it. You can still walk those hills. Still place your hand on the weathered stones where shepherds once knelt and omens were rid in flight and flame. But the real Rome isn't in the ruins. It's in the silence between them, a silence that remembers, even when we forget, that every empire begins as an idea whispered through cracked earth and warm wind, that the divine often enters not through the gates, but through the wild, that what begins in myth does not fade, it echoes. And so Rome, that eternal paradox, was born not cleanly, not nobly, but violently, vividly, and most of all, intentionally. The city was a threshold, and stepping across it was not merely entry, it was transformation. But why this place? Why here, where 7 hills shoulder the sky like sleeping gods, where the Tiber coils like a forgotten snake around riverbanks of stone and soil? Rome did not rise where the land was easiest to tame. It rose where the earth resisted, where it remembered. Etruscan tombs lay buried nearby, whispering a past that was not yet Roman. Greek sailors passed along the coast, trailing myths like smoke. But it was here, in this rough cradle of volcanic ash and iron-rich clay, that the dream took root. Perhaps the ground itself called to something in the human soul, a hunger for permanence in a world that dissolves. The story of Rome's birth is not one myth. It is many colliding like tectonic plates beneath the city's feet. Aeneas, fleeing the fallen Troy, arrives in Latium, not as conqueror, but as memory bearer. He is a man between worlds, carrying both grief and lineage. The poet Virgil, writing long after the Republic had fallen, places him at the origin, not just to sanctify Augustus, but to graft Rome into the bloodstream of older epics. Through Aeneas, Rome becomes heir to Homer, to Ilium, to the embers of fate itself. In this gesture, Rome claims both divine legitimacy and tragic inevitability. It is a city born not in isolation, but in response, a second act to an ancient drama. The myth is not just decorative. It is foundational infrastructure as critical as aqueducts or roads. Rome builds with story, and what it builds, it believes. But myth alone is not enough to hold a people together. So they carved symbols into the rock, lairs and penates, ancestral spirits of hearth and field, and told stories to their children beside the fire. They sacrificed animals at crossroads, read omens in the entrails, shaped their world through ritual until it answered back. The Roman mind was pragmatic but not cynical. It believed the gods could be bargained with, that fate could be managed, if not escaped, that every act, planting, marrying, marching to war, must be accompanied by rites. The city's very walls were sacred. When Romulus plowed the boundary of the new city with a bronze-bladed plow, he did not merely outline a fortification, he consecrated space. He said, this ground is no longer wilderness, it is ours, and ours is watched. Even their language grew like an incantation. Latin did not spread like wildfire. It crept, precise and adaptable, like ivy. The words held weight, formality, permanence. Res publica, senatus, imperium. Language in Rome was a political act. To speak was to rule, to define, to impose structure on the chaos of time. And yet, always, chaos lingered. Beneath the temples, beneath the law codes and banners, Rome trembled with its own contradictions. It wanted order, but drank deeply from the well of myth. It worshipped reason, but lived by augury and sign. It dreamed of peace, but thrived on expansion. This tension, between the rational and the ritual, the civic and the sacred, would not weaken Rome. It would animate it, because to be Roman, even at the beginning, was to be many things at once: citizen and mythmaker, builder and destroyer, child of gods and subject of kings. And so the city emerged, slowly, awkwardly, in smoke and prayer and violence and stone, not as a gleaming capital, not yet, but as a promise whispered through generations, carried in blood and dust and marble, that Rome would outlast the fires that forged it, that no matter how many times it burned, it would be rebuilt. Not as the same, but as something more, something inevitable, something eternal. The whisper in the soil has become voice, and the voice now becomes law. And yet, beneath every founding, a fracture remains, a silence too deep for marble to conceal. What does it mean to be born from myth rather than fact? What does it cost to stitch your identity from borrowed gods, vanquished foes, and rituals soaked in paradox? Rome, even in its cradle, was not innocent. It was already performing itself, a drama dressed in the skin of legend, its chorus echoing through time. It declared itself chosen, but chosen by whom? Not by chance, not by kindness, by blood, by ambition, by the belief that order could rise from violence, and that a city could outlive its sins if it built its walls high enough. So the soil remembers, each layer a tongue, a scar, a prayer. Etruscan symbols carved into rock, long erased but not forgotten. Beneath the temples of Jupiter and Mars, older gods slumber, foreign, ancestral, names worn smooth by the weight of Roman names poured over them like concrete. This is not erasure, this is transformation. Rome does not discard the past, it devours it, and in doing so it becomes both continuity and break. The city is layered, conflicting, magnificent. Brutal in the ways it asserts meaning. Fragile in the myths it must repeat to stay coherent. And that coherence, always precarious, is what draws us back. We walk the same stones. We breathe the dust. We peer into the cracks where wolves once howled and brothers once blood. And still we ask, what is Rome? A beginning, or simply a mirror, held up to each age that dares to name itself civilized. There is a reason Rome was never innocent. It did not begin in harmony. It did not rise from consensus, nor was it dreamed into life by poets alone. It was carved out in conflict, not between peoples, not yet, but between brothers. That is the tone Rome set for itself at birth, sacred, symbolic, and soaked in blood. Romulus and Remus, twins born of a raped Vestal and a god of war, abandoned at the edge of the world, and raised by a creature older than civilization. Their story belongs not only to history, but to something older, to myth's dangerous honesty. Because the truth is, no city, no enduring civilization, is born without a cost. And in Rome's case, that cost was fratricide. The moment arrives with an almost unbearable weight. Romulus has drawn a line in the soil, a furrow with a plow, not yet a wall, but something sacred. The pomerium, the soul-bound skin of a city still in its infancy. It is an act not just of marking land, but of declaring separation. This is Rome, and everything beyond it is not. It is a magical boundary, an invocation, a beginning. But Remus laughs. He mocks the wall, crosses it, and in doing so, he tears at the very fabric his brother is trying to weave. The knife, or club, or stone, comes down. Romulus stands alone. There are many versions. Some say the gods willed it. Some say it was an accident, but none changed the outcome. To found Rome, one brother had to die. The first citizen became the first exile. The first king, the first killer, and Rome, that eternal city, accepted this. Not as shame, but as destiny. It would be born not in peace, but in transgression. It would be shaped not by consent, but by conquest. This is not a footnote in Rome's story. It is its original wound, and Rome would return to that wound again and again, in civil wars, in purges, in betrayals whispered across Senate floors. The fratricide becomes more than history. It becomes a pattern, a ritual, a mask worn by power every time it must justify its violence. Because Rome, even in its earliest breath, understood something darkly profound, that to endure, to command loyalty, to carve a place into the chaos of the world, it must embody not unity but dominance, and dominance by its nature excludes. Romulus named the city after himself, not after his brother, not after their mother, not after their ancestors, just himself. Rome, even in its name, is singular, monarchical, monumental, a city that from its very conception rejected the idea of equal partnership. And yet, this is not just a story of violence. It is a story of transformation. Because from this act, this unbearable, unspeakable moment, came the spark of law, of ritual, of divine order. The people Romulus gathered, criminals, exiles, wanderers, were given a framework, a mythology, not to erase the crime at the city's heart, but to sanctify it. He did not hide what he had done. He built on it. This is the Roman paradox. It does not flinch from its own shadow. It casts it longer, makes it grander. It uses the darkness as foundation, and in doing so, it creates a civilization not of innocence, but of permanence. From one death, 1,000 lives. From one broken bond, 1,000 new allegiances. But still, beneath the palaces and the law codes, beneath the forums and triumphal arches, something of that moment remains. The echo of Remus laughter, the silence after it ends. The city was founded. The line was drawn. And the price of civilization, the real, buried cost, was paid in full. In every founding myth, there is a silence, a moment so sharp, so laden with consequence, that it cannot be spoken plainly. For Rome, that silence fell the instant Remus collapsed, the breath still in his lungs, laughter still curled on his lips. It was not a death born of hatred, not in the way later stories would suggest. No, the tragedy of Remus is not that he was hated, but that he was necessary. The line must be drawn. The wall must matter. The insult could not go unanswered, not because of pride, but because of purpose. In that single act, Rome declared this city is not just geography, it is belief, and belief demands sacrifice. Romulus does not weep, he builds. He buries his brother and raises stones. He names the city after himself, not as vanity, but as declaration. That Rome begins here, with this act, and all who enter its gates will be walking across the memory of blood. From its first breath, Rome is a city unafraid of consequence. It does not flinch from what must be done. It absorbs it. This, then, is Rome's true inheritance, not merely power, not merely glory, but the ability to endure contradiction, to wear its own violence like armor, polished and inscribed with virtue. We must resist the temptation to sanitize the story, to view Remus' death as incidental, as a regrettable accident on the path to greatness. Because Rome itself did not see it that way. The myth was repeated, painted, performed, passed down in temples and poems. The murder was not hidden, it was ritualized. And ritual in Rome is never casual. It is a conversation with the gods, a negotiation with chaos, a contract with time. Even the Lupercalia, the ancient festival of the she-wolf, was infused with the energy of this first rupture. Priests ran through the streets, striking women with strips of sacrificial hide to promote fertility, mimicking the primal, feral grace of the she-wolf that saved the twins. But beneath the fertility rite was the echo of something older, the desperation of beginnings, the strange mingling of sex, survival, and statecraft. Rome's rites remembered what its rhetoric sometimes tried to forget, that civilization was not clean. It was salvaged from wilderness, tooth by tooth. And as Rome grew, it carried that inheritance forward. The right to rule was often proven, not through bloodlines, but through the shedding of blood. Civil strife would become common. Brothers would once again raise arms against each other. The ghosts of Romulus and Remus would walk silently through the halls of the Senate and the fields of Philippi. Because Rome was never just a place. It was an idea, fierce, flawed, seductive, that could outlive those who betrayed or believed in it. An idea forged at the edge of a ploughline, consecrated by death, and made sacred through repetition. Look closely, and you will see that same furrow carved again and again through history, between Caesar and Pompey, between Antony and Octavian, between empire and collapse. Each time, Rome redraws its lines, and each time, someone must fall. And yet, the city endures. It endures because it never tried to be perfect. It tried to be eternal, and that requires myth. That requires memory. That requires the willingness to let the darkest moments become sacred. So let us not avert our gaze from that first violence. Let us linger in the silence after the strike. Because in that stillness, a city was born, not of peace, but of purpose. Rome did not pretend to be innocent. It promised to be remembered. The myth had drawn its first breath. The gods had been invoked. The brother had fallen. Now, Rome had to become real. There is something deeply human in the need to build, not just to live, but to make permanence of presence. To leave behind stone, shaped and sworn, so that the earth might remember us long after our voices fall silent. And so, in the shadow of the furrow drawn by Romulus, the Romans began to build their city. But what they built was not merely shelter. It was sovereignty. The early kings of Rome, half legend, half flesh, ruled a people who were not yet a nation, but who already carried within them the seed of empire. Their stories flicker in and out of historical certainty, cloaked in the glow of oral memory and sacred invention. Yet each king, whether factual or fabled, stands as a threshold, not just of leadership, but of transformation. A reflection of what Rome feared, desired, or aspired to become. Numa Pompilius, the second king, emerges from this haze like a whisper of balance after blood. A Sabine by birth, a priest by temperament, he brought with him not the sword but the calendar. He taught Rome to speak to the divine with rhythm. Rituals for the seasons, rites for the dead, a contract with the gods marked in time. It was under Numa that Rome learned a truth that would follow it through centuries of conquest, that power is not sustained by violence alone. It requires legitimacy, sanctified by story and structure. He built temples not to glorify conquest, but to anchor Rome in something deeper than brute force. The Temple of Janus, whose doors were open in war and closed in peace, became not just a building, but a moral barometer. For most of Rome's life, it stood open. Then came kings like Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius, who fused the spiritual frame with the steel of expansion. The military arm of Rome lengthened. Forts rose where forests once grew. Salt roads were paved, arteries for both commerce and conquest. But always the building served more than utility. It was declaration. To pave a road was to say, we are coming. To raise a wall was to say, we will stay. Under Tarquinius Priscus, the first Etruscan king, Rome dressed itself in the grandeur of foreign art. Arches began to rise. Drainage transformed marsh into forum. Stone replaced mudbrick. And the city, once a collection of huts on hills, began to resemble power made physical. But this transformation was not smooth. Every stone added to the city's frame introduced a new question: who lays the foundation and who holds the crown? The kings held vast authority, too vast. They wore the purple. They bore the fasces. But sovereignty, once given physical shape, awakens hunger in others. When power is no longer just divine but visible, measurable, ceremonial, it becomes dangerous. It invites envy. It incites resistance. This danger crystallized in the reign of Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He did not rule, he imposed. His reign was marked not by balance but by brutality. Under him, the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus was completed, the largest and most sacred of all temples in the city. It was both triumph and warning, a god enthroned above a people held down. The temple stood on the Capitoline Hill, the symbolic head of the Roman body. But beneath it simmered the same old question: who rules, and by what right? The answer would come, not from policy, but from outrage, from a single act that tore open the veneer of authority. The rape of Lucretia, a noblewoman violated by the king's son, did not stay a private tragedy. It detonated a revolution. Her suicide became sacrifice. Her body, displayed in the forum, became mirror and torch. What was once obedience cracked into fury. The people expelled their king. The monarchy collapsed, but the stone remained. The forums, the temples, the sacred rites. These did not burn with the fall of Tarquin. They endured, because they were not merely extensions of kings, but manifestations of a Roman identity larger than any ruler. The city had begun to understand something profound, that while men might fail, institutions, if forged correctly, could outlive them. So Rome kept the crown's symbols. The purple robes, the scepter, the lictors with their bundles of rods and axes. But it removed the king. It split the power, divided it, embedded it into ritual and law. In that moment, the Republic was born, not as an invention, but as an answer to tyranny. And thus the city passed through its first great transformation. From huts to marble, from monarchy to memory, from myth to mechanism. Rome had become more than a name. It had become a system, and systems, once set in motion, are harder to kill than kings. But even as the kings were cast out, their shadows remained, long and carved into marble. The stones they raised did not forget them. The temples they consecrated still whispered their names. The forum, once a marshland, drained and paved under the Etruscan kings, remained the living heart of the city, proof that sovereignty, once poured into stone, is never easily undone. Power leaves residue like smoke on walls, like blood in soil. In that residue, the Romans saw both fear and inheritance. They hated kings, but they kept the rituals. They destroyed tyranny, but preserved the symbols. The fasces, the bound rods and axes that once marched before monarchs, would be carried now by consuls. The temple of Jupiter, once a royal ambition, became a republic's divine anchor. Rome would never again wear the crown, but it would never unbuild the throne. What does it mean, then, to erase a man but keep his monument? This was the beginning of Rome's most enduring trait, its genius for transformation without abandonment. The Romans rarely rejected their past, they repurposed it. A temple becomes a church. A basilica becomes a courtroom. A tyrant's law becomes a tradition. The city shifts, not suddenly, but by slow accretion. Layers upon layers, like sediment turned to stone. Even the concept of the city began to change. No longer just a sacred enclosure or a king's domain, it became a stage, a setting upon which citizenship itself would play out. The city became a metaphor for Roman identity, physical, yes, but also philosophical. A place you could belong to even if you never walked its streets. Rome was becoming an idea, sculpted from ritual and myth, codified in architecture, baptized by rebellion. And yet, beneath the political evolution, the spiritual transformation continued. The kings had given Rome more than infrastructure. They had given it its earliest vocabulary of power, its calendar, its gods, its rites of passage. These weren't just superstitions clinging to the edges of law. They were the law. Every public action, from trials to treaties, was shadowed by augury. Every battle marched with the gods' approval. Rome did not simply believe in the divine. It embedded it, encoded it. The state was sacred. The city was consecrated. That sanctity, half belief, half instrument, gave Roman power its peculiar tone. It could conquer ruthlessly, but always beneath the banner of fate. It could slaughter, but invoke duty. This is the mask of power, not to lie, but to wear truth as costume. And the Roman kings, for all their flaws, had helped design that mask, polished it until it gleamed. And then it cracked. Not just through Tarquin's fall, but through what followed. Because revolution is not a clean slate. It is an aftershock. The republic that emerged was not purity reborn. It was compromise, ambition, fear. Two consuls where there was once one king. A senate that could advise, but not command. A people still haunted by what they had destroyed. Still uncertain what they had built. But through that uncertainty, Rome endured. Because it had something greater than a king. It had continuity. Ritual. Memory. Myth stone. Even now, as we walk the ruins of the Forum, we are walking through that tension. The stones beneath our feet were laid by kings, marched upon by senators, wept over by slaves, and sermonized by popes. The same pavement has felt the pressure of sandals, sabots, jackboots, and sneakers. The city shifts, but does not break. That is what makes Rome eternal. Not that it never fell, but that it never stayed fallen. That it refused to erase its past, even when its past was bloody, shameful, or lost to fog. The Roman kingdom, that strange hybrid of myth and monarchy, did not vanish. It was digested, folded into memory, layered into marble, made usable by a city that understood, even then, that the only true power is to endure through reinvention. This was not the end. It was the first echo. Before Rome could find its face, it first had to look into a mirror. And what it saw was not itself. It saw the Etruscans. A civilization older than Rome, wiser in mystery, more fluent in the language of death and divinity. The Etruscans knew how to bury a king with gold, how to carve a smile into terracotta that would last 1,000 years. They did not shout their truths. They whispered them through bronze mirrors, painted tombs, labyrinthine rituals. Rome, still young and hungry, listened. From the Etruscans, Rome borrowed more than just artisanship or superstition. It borrowed structure, the arch, the sewer, the augur's staff, the gleaming grin of a god that was half human, half symbol. The early Roman kings, particularly the Tarquins, were steeped in Etruscan blood and tradition. They wore the signs of power with precision: the purple robe, the curule chair, the lictor's fasces. These weren't Roman inventions. They were performances learned from a stage already ancient. And yet, like all things Rome touched, the borrowed soon became naturalized. This was not imitation. It was absorption. Rome had no need to destroy the Etruscans. It simply outlived them. But buried within this absorption was a tension that never fully resolved. The Etruscans believed in signs, that the flight of birds could speak, that lightning was language, that fate could be read in a liver. And so did the Romans. But where the Etruscans saw divinity as enigma, Rome sought utility. What mattered was not what the gods said, but what could be done with what they seemed to mean. This divergence would shape the Roman soul. The Etruscans worship mystery. Rome mined it for order. In the Etruscan world, death was not an end but a realm. Their tombs were cities of the underworld, rooms painted with dancers and banquets, a celebration of passage. Rome inherited the architecture, but not the comfort. For all its grandeur, Rome feared death more than the Etruscans did. It saw the underworld not as continuation, but as consequence. Its rituals became more rigid, more contractual, prayers that sounded like treaties, funerals that felt like obligations. In that shift, we see the Roman mind sharpening, recasting even the sacred into system. But systems leave traces. And the Etruscans, though conquered, are not gone. Their language is nearly lost, but their fingerprints remain. In the tiles of early temples, in the curvature of aqueducts, in the silent knowledge behind every Roman triumph. Rome rarely admits it, but it was not born fully formed. It was shaped, molded in clay dug from Etruscan earth, hardened in kilns built by foreign hands. And this shaping was not a betrayal of identity. It was the beginning of it. Because Rome was never pure. It was never meant to be. Its genius lay not in invention, but in synthesis. It became powerful by becoming plural, drawing gods from Greece, engineering from Carthage, discipline from Sparta, and story from Troy. But it began with the Etruscans, its first mirror. The irony, of course, is that Rome would eventually erase the Etruscans from its official story. Their names fade. Their tombs fall silent. Their gods are renamed. Even their script becomes illegible. It is the first great forgetting in Roman history, and perhaps the most revealing. Because in every civilization, there is a moment where gratitude gives way to amnesia, where influence is masked by mastery. Rome did not thank the Etruscans. It became them and then declared itself original. But the stones remember. The arches, the drains, the sacred geometry of the augur's quadrant. They all whisper of another time, another hand. And so the story bends again. Rome rises not from a blank slate, but from a palimpsest, a text overwritten, a city born in layers, each one both legacy and loss. To become Rome was never to be whole. It was always to contain the forgotten. To walk the necropolises of Etruria is to enter a theater of silence. Carved chambers lined with painted banquets, dancers frozen mid-movement, a world beyond death more vivid than life itself. Here the Etruscans built not just tombs but echoes, worlds within the earth, symbols wrapped in color and bone. Rome walked those passages, and when it emerged, it was not unchanged. It took their gods. Tinia became Jupiter, Uni became Juno, Merva became Minerva, but they arrived already Roman, their names washed in Latin, their edges squared. Rome did not just adopt divinity, it disciplined it. The Etruscans had worshipped in ritual chaos, with omens unfolding like riddles. Rome preferred structure. Priests became officials. Augury became office. The sacred was brought into the civic. Mystery was rendered procedural. But within that conversion, something was lost. The softness of myth, the ambiguity of worship. The Etruscans had embraced the unknowable. Rome learned to fear it. Fear what it couldn't control. And so, even as Rome built temples in Etruscan forms, it redefined them, turning fluid mythology into a machinery of state. Still, the mirror did not forget. The Etruscan grin, that enigmatic curve seen on statues and sarcophagi, lingered in the Roman imagination like a secret it couldn't quite name. It was a smile that knew something, about pleasure, about mortality, about the absurdity of kings, and it haunted Rome, even as it conquered the people who made it. Because somewhere deep in its stone heart, Rome knew it had not invented itself. That knowledge was both pride and wound. To claim ancestry from Troy was poetic. To inherit power from the Etruscans, a people viewed as decadent, obscure, dangerously foreign, was something else. Rome buried that part of the story, erased it from the official chronicle, let it sink beneath the marble of later centuries. But listen closely in the forum. When the crowds have left and the wind skates through the arches, you can hear the Etruscan voice. Not loud, not proud, but present. In the Capitol's foundations, in the shape of the Cloaca Maxima, in the lictor's silent steps. Rome was never pure marble, it was terracotta first, and every empire, before it casts itself in permanence, must pass through pliability. That was the Etruscan gift, to teach Rome how to bend, so that it might later not break. There are thresholds in history where the story does not unfold, it ruptures. Moments when the architecture of power, long unquestioned, cracks in a single breath. In Rome, one such breath belonged to a woman named Lucretia. She was not a queen, not a warrior, not a goddess sculpted in marble. She was a Roman matron, chaste, dignified, devoted to her household. And yet, it is her name that echoes through the centuries, not for how she lived, but for how she died. and what her death unmade. The fall of Tarquin did not begin in the Senate. It did not begin in the battlefield or in divine omen. It began in a room, in the stillness of night, when Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, crossed the boundary between desire and domination. He did not seduce, he violated. And when Lucretia awoke to what had been taken, she did not hide. She summoned witnesses, she named her violator, and then, with a blade drawn not in revenge, but in refusal, she ended her life. Her death was not a retreat, it was a signal fire, a silence so loud it ignited revolution. Because in that moment Rome saw what monarchy had become, not strength but sickness, not nobility but impunity. Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome, had ruled not through love or law, but through spectacle and fear. His reign, opulent and absolute, had elevated the crown while extinguishing the citizen. And when that mask finally slipped, when the violence turned inward, into the domestic, into the sacred body of a Roman wife, something deeper snapped. Lucius Junius Brutus stepped forward, not the Brutus of Caesar's death, but his ancestor, equally shaped by betrayal, equally shadowed by purpose. He took Lucretia's body, placed it in the forum, and let it speak. Not with words, but with accusation. A king's son had trespassed the boundary between ruler and ruled. And for that a crown had to fall. The people rose. Tarquin was expelled, not quietly, not gracefully. His statues were toppled. His name burned into infamy. The monarchy, once divinely sanctioned, became anathema. Rome would never again suffer a king. But revolution is not rebirth. It is rearrangement. And what came next was not a golden age. It was a new experiment in power. The Roman Republic. A state without kings, but not without hierarchy. 2 consuls would replace the monarch, equal, term, limited, elected. But behind them stood old families, old resentments, and an aristocracy that had merely traded titles, not temperaments. Still, something had shifted. Rome had crossed a line. It had learned that sovereignty could be shattered, not just by armies, but by outrage. That the body politic could be moved not only by ambition, but by grief, and that violence against one could awaken identity in many. Lucretia's death became more than a tragedy. It became Rome's origin myth of liberty. The Republic would carry her image forward, not on coins or temples, but in its psyche. She was the warning and the vow that no ruler, however powerful, could ignore the dignity of the people and endure. But as with all Roman stories, the symbol outlived the substance. In time, the Republic would create its own masks. Power would grow opaque again. Violence would return in new forms, dressed in legality sanctified by ritual. And women, always the ground upon which power was inscribed, would remain voices spoken about, rarely spoken by. Yet still, the silence Lucretia left behind continues to echo. In it we hear Rome's capacity for reinvention, its instinct for ritualizing rupture, its genius for turning personal trauma into political mythology. This is the Roman gift, and the Roman curse to never let a death remain only a death, to fold it into narrative, to raise it into permanence. And so a king fell, not by sword, but by story, and the city stepped through another threshold, not toward clarity, but toward complexity. But what, exactly, collapsed with the expulsion of Tarquin? It was more than a monarchy. It was an illusion. That power could be absolute and still sacred. That sovereignty could dwell in the body of a man and not turn sour with time. Tarquin shattered that. He ruled not as shepherd, but as predator. And the city, still young but already burdened with memory, recoiled, not from authority, but from its concentration. The monarchy had clothed itself in Etruscan splendor, purple robes, golden thrones, the solemn hush of augurs reading omens. But now those trappings felt grotesque. The regalia became symbols of rot. The divine right that once gave Rome order now echoed with abuse. And as the people tore the crown from their king, they tore away something deeper. Their innocence about what rule could become. The revolution was not instantaneous, nor was it pure. It was a storm of grief and fury, of shame weaponized into transformation. Lucretia's death became a myth not to be mourned but enacted. It was performed again and again, not to honor her as victim, but to inscribe her into the city's moral ledger. Her violation became the hinge of legitimacy. From her body, Rome drew a line that no king would ever again cross. At least, not openly. And this was the beginning of a Roman habit to craft new forms from old wounds. The Republic that followed did not discard power. It diffused it. Split it, doubled it, buried it beneath oaths and rituals. 2 consuls now shared what one king had once held. They served only a year. They could be vetoed, replaced, tried. The city no longer belonged to the will of one. It belonged to process, to form, to precedent. And yet, beneath the rules lay a memory, still hot, still smoldering. The fear of tyranny was never exorcised. It was institutionalized. Even the word rex, king, became taboo, an accusation, a slur, a weapon in the mouth of a Roman citizen. Power had not died, but its mask had changed. It now wore the face of law. And yet, masks, however well crafted, can slip. Rome's new order still bore the scars of what it had escaped. The patricians, those noble families who engineered the fall of the monarchy, now held the reins. They traded crowns for curule chairs, palaces for tribunals, but the essence was the same: control. The Republic was not born for all Romans. It was born for those whose blood had not mixed with servitude. The plebeians, the commoners, would have to fight again, not with swords, but with silence, with secession, with withdrawal from the state they sustained. This tension, between the old elite and the restless many, would define the Republic's deepest anxieties. Lucretia's death had ended one injustice, but unveiled many more. Because revolution rarely delivers justice, it delivers change, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, always incomplete. And yet, this incomplete thing, fragile, contested, riven by contradiction, endured. Rome now had a republic. Not because it was inevitable, but because it was necessary. A city that could no longer bear to be ruled had chosen instead to be ruled by itself, even if the self was fractured. This choice, imperfect, improvised, immortalized, would shape not only Rome, but the imagination of every republic that followed. Greece had democracy, but Rome had the republic, a system built not on equality but on equilibrium, a balance of ambition and fear, authority and resistance, law and memory. And at the heart of that balance stood a woman whose name would never be forgotten, not for her life, but for what was taken from it. Lucretia. She never held office. She never stood in the forum, and yet she occupies its foundation, not a statue, not a title, but a silence that haunts every oath taken in its shadow. Revolution had opened the gates, but now came the harder work: what to build in place of a king. Rome stood trembling on the edge of its own becoming. The last monarch had been driven out, his statues defaced, his name accursed. But hatred of tyranny alone could not hold a city together. A void had opened at the heart of the state, and into that void, the Romans poured something both ancient and unprecedented: law, not divine law, not royal command, but something more brittle and yet more powerful: agreement, debate, procedure. The Republic was not born all at once. It was pieced together, quarrel by quarrel, forged in the fires of fear and memory. A new architecture of power emerged, still rigid, still hierarchical, but now shared, now watchful of itself. It was not a system designed for progress. It was a system designed to prevent return. At the center stood the consuls, two men elected equal in title, bound to a single year of authority. They replaced the king, but not with a singular voice. With tension. The right to command was now counterbalanced by the right to veto. No longer would Rome be ruled from the top down. Now it would move forward only through friction. It was an experiment. A dangerous one, and yet it worked. In a world of monarchies and divine right, Rome became a republic. Not a utopia, not a democracy, but a negotiated performance of civic memory. The republic functioned not because it was perfect, but because it feared its own collapse. It trusted neither man nor God, only balance. A pendulum swinging perpetually between aristocratic authority and popular unrest. But the wounds of monarchy ran deep. Even the language bore scars. The title, rex, king, became unspeakable in praise. The consul might wield imperium, the highest form of civil and military power, but he must never appear to enjoy it. Modesty was enforced. Visibility was restricted. In public, the consul walked with lictors, bodyguards bearing the fasces. But those rods were not symbols of unchecked power. They were reminders. Power comes bundled, tied, and fragile. The axe was not always exposed, and yet the Republic was no illusion of equality. It was built for the patricians, Rome's noble families who had once served the kings and now served each other. They saw in the Republic not a loss of power, but a chance to preserve it beneath new ritual. The Senate, unelected but revered, became the conscience of the state, or its ghost. It could not command, but it advised with gravity that kings might envy. It remembered, it reminded, it lingered. But even here, beneath the laws and offices, something deeper stirred. Rome was no longer a city of subjects. It was a city of citizens. Men bound not by loyalty to a ruler, but to a res publica, a shared thing. The Republic was not a place. It was a responsibility. Citizenship was not a birthright alone. It was a duty to act, to vote, to fight, to serve. And in that strange communion, between elite and commoner, magistrate and mob, Rome found a soul. That soul was never still. It roiled with contradiction. Patricians resisted plebeians. Plebeians seceded, negotiated, demanded. Tribunes were created. Officials who could veto laws, whose persons were sacred. A new kind of power emerged, one not granted from above, but demanded from below. It was resilience. The Republic evolved not by vision, but by crisis. Each rupture brought reform. Each wound, a scar of protection. The 12 tables, the tribunate, the right of appeal, known were gifts. All were one, and yet the system endured, because it knew how to remember. Rome's past was never buried. It was inscribed, etched into law, carved into stone. Each innovation was retrofitted into a myth. The Republic made itself sacred not through bloodline, but through precedent, through story. In doing so, Rome taught itself how to survive. It learned to mistrust simplicity. It learned that the best defense against tyranny was not virtue, but structure. And above all, it learned to keep asking the same question, over and over again, echoing across centuries, who should hold power, and for how long? The Republic, imperfect, improvised, enduring, was not a clean break from monarchy. It was a negotiation with memory. Rome did not simply reject kingship, it fossilized it, then buried it beneath new rituals, new fears, new laws. And in that burial, it built something unprecedented, a state not ruled by a man, but by an idea. That power must be divided to be safe, contained to be legitimate, ritualized to be trusted. And yet, the idea itself was fragile. Every year, the 2 consuls were elected anew, a ceremony both sacred and strategic. Their very temporariness was a signal. No one reigns forever. No one commands unchecked. And yet beneath the symmetry of dual rule pulsed a nervous energy, the knowledge that ambition could not be erased, only delayed. Rome's laws were meant not to inspire trust in virtue, but to anticipate betrayal. It was a society built around friction, deliberate delay, intentionally slow machinery. The Senate did not rush. The assemblies did not always speak with clarity. Power was negotiated like a contract between ancestors and heirs, guarded not by gods but by memory and form. And through this choreography of caution, the Republic did not stumble, it danced. But that dance had a rhythm of its own, privilege circling protest, reform echoing repression. The patricians held the center, the plebeians the periphery, until they didn't, until they walked away. The secession of the plebs, a silent strike of citizenship, was not violence. It was absence. It was a reminder that Rome was not marble and lineage, but labor and consent. The state left hollow, bent. And so, the office of the tribune was born. The tribune did not command armies. He wielded no sword. But he had something stranger, something deeply Roman, sacrosanctitas, the sacredness of his body. To harm a tribune was to offend the gods, and thus the law. His voice could veto decisions of the consuls, the Senate, even the momentum of Rome itself. He was a guardian not of power, but of the powerless. And his existence marked a new chapter 1 in which resistance was institutionalized. From kings to consuls, from subjects to citizens, from law as command to law as compromise. And yet, compromise is not peace. The Republic was always in tension with itself. Every safeguard carried within it the shadow of fear, every office a memory of what had once gone wrong. Even the calendar was political, sacred days on which assemblies could not meet, festivals encoded with caution. Rome did not simply build a republic. It engineered a system of breaks, checks, counterweights, rituals. A machine of memory disguised as governance. It is tempting, now, to see this as brilliance, as foresight. But it was not that. It was something deeper, something more Roman. The trauma of kingship, of Tarquin and Lucretia, cast a long shadow. The Republic was, in many ways, a city-sized scar. It did not forget. It could not. And so, every decision was shaped by that memory of too much power, too much glory, too much trust placed in one man. And still, ambition found ways to breathe. Behind every consul stood a general. Behind every reform, a rival. Rome had created a system to prevent monarchy. But in doing so, it had also created a new kind of stage. One where visibility mattered. Reputation was currency. And glory, that ancient Roman obsession, became the quiet enemy of equilibrium. The Republic endured because it feared itself. It evolved through fracture. It survived by ritualizing dissent. And through that endurance, Rome, the city, became Rome, the state of mind. A place where law is not just code, but character. Where power is always suspect, and legitimacy must be re-earned with every generation. That was the genius of the Republic, not perfection, but persistence. Beneath the marbled pride of the Senate and the gleam of patrician togas, a slow tremor gathered, not loud, not sudden, but insistent. It moved through the cracks of the city like groundwater in drought, quiet yet vital. This was the pulse of the plebeians, farmers, soldiers, bakers, builders, the many hands that held Rome up, yet found themselves without a seat at its table. Their hunger did not speak in violence first. It whispered in absence. One day they walked away. It was not a riot. It was a retreat to the sacred mount. There, on the outskirts of the city they bled for, the plebeians simply stopped. Stopped working. Stopped fighting. Stopped feeding the Republic with their sweat and their sons. It was the first true secessio plebis, a withdrawal not just of labor, but of belief. The Republic, stripped of its lower body, stood paralyzed, a torso without legs. The patricians felt it then. Rome was not the Senate, it was the people. And the people had vanished. This was not merely protest, it was revelation. The Republic had claimed to be built on shared virtue, on law, on liberty. But in truth, its foundations had been exclusion wrapped in ritual. The plebeians had lived in the shadow of power, beneath the weight of ancestral names and sacred customs that bore no reflection of their own voices. No office protected them. No forum heard them. They were present in the census, absent in the law. Now they had turned their silence into leverage. The concession came not from generosity, but necessity. The tribune of the plebs was born. An office not imposed from above, but carved from the resolve of those below. His body was sacred, inviolable. His word was a shield, his veto a weapon. The very architecture of Roman governance had cracked open to let this figure emerge like a statue released from stone. And yet, the tribunate was not the end. It was a beginning. Across the next generations, the plebeians would not rest with symbolism. They wanted substance. Access to the consulship, relief from debt, rights to intermarry with the patrician elite. Step by agonizing step, they forced the Republic to reflect the breadth of its people. Not as a gift, but as a negotiation. It was not an equal republic. It never would be, but Rome had been changed. The struggle of the orders, so often framed as dry legal conflict, was in truth a battle for the soul of the city. It asked the oldest questions anew: who counts? Who belongs? Who decides? And in that struggle, a strange paradox took root. Rome became stronger not by suppressing dissent, but by absorbing it. It did not destroy its margins, it made them part of its center. Not easily, not cleanly, but irrevocably. This was Rome's genius, and its curse. Because even as the plebeians rose, new hierarchies formed, new elites emerged from their ranks. The tribunate itself could be co-opted, corrupted, used as tool or threat. The Republic had learned to bend, but bending did not mean healing. The fault lines had shifted. They had not disappeared. Still, in the plebeian uprising we find one of Rome's deepest truths, that even a city built on conquest must at times conquer itself. And in doing so, it becomes something more than empire, more than marble. It becomes memory, a memory that includes not just the voices that shouted from podiums, but those that walked away and made the city follow. But even as the plebeians won a voice, the sound of their triumph echoed back at them with strange dissonance. Their secession had opened the gates of transformation. But what lay beyond was no promised land, only deeper complexity. Rome, like all great cities, did not yield its power easily. It absorbed dissent not to erase it, but to wear it as armor. The tribunate became their sanctuary, but also their battlefield. Within its sacred limits, tribunes could halt laws, protect citizens, summon the people. They could confront the very machinery of elite privilege. Yet with every tool won, a new trap was laid. The patricians, masters of adaptation, learned not to resist outright, but to co-opt, to manipulate, to invite the plebeians into halls whose rules they did not write. And some plebeians, seduced by proximity to power, accepted. This was the next rupture in Rome's evolving soul, when the line between oppression and ambition blurred, and revolution became aspiration. The plebs no longer moved as one mass. A new strata formed. Plebeian nobles, men of rising wealth, land, and pride, who used the office of tribune not to shatter the old order, but to rise within it. Reform became rhetoric. Protest became performance. The city did not silence its lower classes. It taught them how to climb. And yet, not all were climbing. In the countryside, debt still crushed families. In the city, landlords still bled tenants dry. The grain dole was not a favor, it was survival. Beneath the veneer of compromise, injustice endured. The Republic had expanded the circle of power, but it had not redrawn its center. The margins persisted, quieter now, but haunted. Still, Rome was changed. It had learned to flex. This was not the stiffness of monarchy, nor the chaos of mob rule. It was something strange, a republic that refused final form, forever improvising between control and concession. Every crisis became a laboratory, every uprising a mirror. Rome began to look at itself. The Senate, once the unchallenged core of aristocracy, now sat under the watchful eyes of tribunes, of assemblies, of citizens who had tasted agency and would not forget the flavor. Law itself became theater, ideology negotiation, and behind every speech, every veto, every march to the sacred mount, pulsed a deeper question: can a city survive when its soul is in conflict with itself? Rome did not answer, it endured. The voices of the forgotten had forced themselves into the bloodstream of the Republic. They had not overthrown it. They had become it. And in doing so, they left a legacy far greater than reforms. They proved that a city could remake itself from below. That sovereignty was not a fixed shape, but a fire passed between hands. Unevenly, painfully, but passed nonetheless. This was the genius of Rome and the terror, because once the masses know they are needed, they do not go back to silence. They watch, they wait, and they remember. He was found behind a plow. The sun pressed hard into his back. His hands were calloused, his tunic worn thin by earth and years. And when they told him the Republic needed him, Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus said nothing. He simply wiped the soil from his brow and followed. So begins one of Rome's most enduring masks. They would later say that he saved the state in 16 days, that he took up supreme power, dictator, only to return it, untouched by ambition, once the enemy had fled. They tell of how he walked home in silence, returned to his field, and bent again to the furrows as though the world had never asked him to rule it. It is a tale Rome loved to tell of itself. It glowed like burnished bronze in the halls of the Senate, echoed across centuries in marble and myth. A citizen soldier, a man of duty, a figure who proved that virtue meant knowing when to let go. But that glow, like all polished things, reflects more than it reveals. For what does it mean when a civilization sanctifies simplicity in the shape of a man called only when chaos rises? When it venerates those who relinquish power, yet builds its system to require such men again and again, Cincinnatus becomes more than a man. He becomes a standard, a ghost, a pressure. Every Roman politician who followed bore the weight of that ideal, even as the Republic bent further toward corruption, inequality, and self-interest. His legend held up a mirror, but the Rome that stared back grew increasingly unrecognizable. Beneath the mask of Cincinnatus lay a quieter truth that simplicity, once mythologized, can be weaponized. Because if the highest virtue is withdrawal, then who dares speak of reform? If the citizen is honored for not desiring power, then what of those who challenge power to change it? The mask makes discontent seem decadent. It elevates obedience. It glamorizes silence. This is how Rome hid its fractures in plain sight. The patrician elite invoked Cincinnatus when they wished to shame the ambitious. But rarely did they imitate him. Landowners amassed estates. Magistrates lingered in office. Tribunes grew louder, assemblies more divided. The city's soul tilted further from the soil and closer to spectacle, oratory, inheritance. And yet the image endured. The man behind the plow, serene and selfless. Because every empire needs its holy lie. Cincinnatus was not Rome's conscience. He was its alibi. He excused the Senate's failings. He soothed the people's doubts. He wrapped the contradictions of the Republic. Violence and virtue, hierarchy and liberty. In a fable so elegant it dulled the ache of complexity. But what happens when a republic mistakes its fables for facts? Rome, like every civilization, carved monuments not just from stone, but from longing for purity, for nobility, for a time when power could be wielded without consequence and laid down without cost. Cincinnatus is that longing made flesh. But he is also a warning. Because even as the Republic chanted his name, its institutions grew brittle, its inequalities widened, the masks grew heavier, and the plow was taken up less and less. In the distance, beyond the fields and beyond the myth, something stirred. The Republic had made virtue a memory. What came next would make ambition a birthright. But beneath the myth of the plowshare and the public servant lies a question more dangerous than any sword. What if Cincinnatus was never meant to be followed, only invoked? Because Rome, even at its most virtuous, was never simple. It was layered like its 7 hills, ambition stacked upon duty, glory beside compromise. Cincinnatus was carved into the soul of the Republic not to reflect its truth, but to obscure its machinery. His name was whispered not to call citizens upward, but to call critics downward, back into the fields, back into silence. For while the image of the reluctant dictator shimmered in the minds of Romans, the world around them refused to conform. Wealth pooled in aristocratic hands. Wars abroad enriched a few while draining the many. Power, like wine, grew sweeter the longer it aged in the Senate's amphorae. Hard to uncork, impossible to share. The real Republic was not a man who gave up power. It was a structure that made giving it up impossible without legend. Consider this: every time a Roman orator hailed the memory of Cincinnatus, he did so beneath marble ceilings funded by conquest, flanked by clients, backed by bloodlines. The fields were no longer within sight. The ideal had become theater. The mask had become the face. And so Cincinnatus, the humble, became a paradox. He embodied a value that no longer existed, in a system that could no longer afford it. His virtue was displayed like a relic, while the city pulsed with contradiction. What endures is not his retirement, but the seductive lie of it. That power can be pure if only it is brief. That virtue is measured in retreat, not resistance. That to govern well is to disappear. But empires are not built by those who disappear. They are built by those who learn how to hide in plain sight. This is the mask of virtue, not to act justly, but to appear as though one might have. And yet, even myths have their uses. Cincinnatus gave Rome something to reach toward, a moral compass, even if cracked. In times of crisis, his ghost would be summoned not for what he was, but for what Rome still wanted to believe about itself. He haunted the Republic like a forgotten promise, the shadow of what it could have been. If only its citizens had truly wanted a plow more than a scepter, but the field would grow cold, the plow would rust, and Rome would move forward, not by turning away from power, but by learning to hold it more artfully. Cincinnatus faded into legend, and legend became precedent. The Republic survived, for now, but beneath its marble facade, the seeds of something new were already stirring. Not withdrawal but will, not simplicity but spectacle. The plow would return, yes, but only as symbol, not as truth. And when Rome looked again to the man who had once walked away, it would not see a farmer. It would see a throne. There is a silence that falls over the Roman Forum at dusk, not of peace, but of memory. The stones remember. They remember the moment when expansion stopped being strategy and became identity, when Rome ceased to grow to survive and began to survive to grow. In the beginning, war had a shape. It was seasonal, ritualistic, a farmer's necessity to defend field and kin, a brief interruption before the harvest. But over time, it grew teeth. The seasons blurred, the sword stayed drawn. Rome, that once pastoral city of shepherds and rites, was learning to hunger. Not for protection, but for permanence. Not for peace, but for permanence through conquest. And somewhere between the smoke of Veii and the salt of Carthage, something irreversible took root. Expansion became the soul of the Republic. The Senate had no map for this transformation. It didn't legislate it. It intuited it, in the way a predator shifts its weight before a kill. Every new enemy became a mirror, every victory, a question. What are we if we stop? Who are we when there is no frontier left to conquer? For the Roman elite, the answer was terrifying. Power began to pool in strange places. Military command, once bound to term limits and ceremony, drifted into personal legacy. A consul could now be a conqueror, and a conqueror, something more dangerous, a man with the loyalty of armies and the silence of the Senate in his favor. The cursus honorum, the sacred ladder of public service, buckled under the weight of ambition. What was once a republic of farmers and laws became a republic of generals and debts. Take the example of Marcus Claudius Marcellus, time consul, who paraded Greek spoils through Rome after the sack of Syracuse. Gold sculpture maps, all alien wonders spilled across the forum. For many Romans, it was a revelation. For others, it was a reckoning. The old simplicity was vanishing. The old walls could not hold what Rome was becoming. With each campaign, the boundaries of identity blurred. Were they defenders or aggressors? Liberators or plunderers? Romans or something else entirely? The gods themselves seemed to shift. Jupiter, once the sovereign sky father, became a god of imperial spectacle. Mars was no longer the guardian of order, but the engine of expansion. Even the rituals, the triumphs, the oaths, the auguries, began to serve not faith, but propaganda. The sacred and the civic fused into a performance of permanence. And yet, amid all this glory, a wound. For expansion demanded not just victory, but vulnerability, a tearing open of the Roman soul. Peasant soldiers returned to find their farms in ruin, their wives sold, their homes swallowed by debt. The spoils of war, they discovered, were not for them. The wealth flowed upward. The empire was being built on the backs of the very citizens who once sustained the Republic. This was not conquest. This was a transformation of scale. The wars, Samnite, Punic, Macedonian, did not merely extend Rome's territory, they rewired its ethics. Expansion redefined what it meant to be Roman. Citizenship became diluted, negotiated, promised, and weaponized. Alliances became chains. To be part of Rome now meant being part of its wars, whether you lived inside the city or 2 weeks' march away. And so, the frontier became everywhere, and nowhere. Rome could not stop, because to stop was to shrink, and to shrink was to die. The machine needed provinces. The provinces needed garrisons. The garrisons needed taxes. And the taxes fed new wars. It was not a circle. It was a spiral. Forward, outward, always, like a heartbeat addicted to motion. Even the language changed. The Senate no longer spoke of neighbors. They spoke of opportunities. The Republic no longer feared annihilation. It feared irrelevance. And in this moment, so quietly you might miss it, Rome became what it had once sworn never to be, an empire in all but name, not by decree, not by law, but by appetite. By this point, the Republic was still intact, the forms were still there. The elections, the speeches, the togas. But underneath, something tectonic had shifted. Power no longer rose from the people. It flowed from legions and land. War had become Rome's biography. And perhaps, its destiny. Because when a civilization forgets how to define itself without war, it will choose conflict even when peace is offered. Not because it must, but because it no longer knows how not to. And then came the wolves. Not the mythic ones who nursed Rome in infancy, but the ones who howled at the gates of empire. Gauls, Numidians, Parthians. Each a mirror of the city's own ambition turned outward. Rome had taught the world how to be hungry. The world, in turn, learned how to bite back. But long before the empire stretched across continents, Rome learned to fear stasis more than chaos. In the deep marrow of its republic, fear and discipline became virtues and movement. The sacred necessity. A citizen who stood still was a liability. A city that did not push outward risked folding inward. Consider the Punic Wars. Not only a contest of armies, but of philosophies. Carthage traded. Rome conquered. Carthage sought balance. Rome demanded totality. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, it was not just elephants and fury he brought. It was a question. Could Rome be outwitted? Could it bleed? The answer came not with a single battle, but with an ethic persistence as identity. Losses did not break Rome. They incinerated her hesitations. From Canna's ash came a doctrine more terrifying than victory: endurance at any cost. And so, a civilization hardened into something elemental. It didn't just defeat Carthage. It erased it, salted it, sang of its destruction as if singing of birth. What Rome destroyed, it made sacred. This was the paradox that haunted the Republic. Expansion forged unity, and simultaneously fracture. The further Rome reached, the more tenuous its center became. Legions loyal to generals, not the Senate. Wealth flowing east, while farms in Latium withered into memory. The spoils of Sicily and Spain fed temples and theater, but also greed, resentment, rot. And what of the ordinary Roman? The cobbler, the clerk, the child walking home from a lesson in rhetoric. They learned, subtly, through stories and sculpture, that glory lived not in justice, but in victory. That the greatness of Rome was no longer a matter of who they were, but how far they could extend themselves into the unknown. The forum's marble whispered this gospel. The walls of triumphal arches hummed with it. Even the calendar conspired with conquest. Months renamed for emperors. Days marked not by harvests, but by victories. The passing of time itself bent to Rome's appetite. And still, it was not enough. There is a peculiar torment in being a civilization that succeeds at everything except stopping. Rome became an empire before it realized what empire meant. It had no imperial ideology, only motion. Expansion was not explained, it was embodied. It became invisible, like air, like blood. A thing so assumed that to question it felt sacrilegious. But beneath the armor and the amphitheaters, something quieter stirred: fatigue. Some sensed it early, the Stoics writing of limits and inner peace, while their city prepared another campaign. Some resisted, like Tiberius Gracchus, who stood in the rotting shadow of conquest and cried out for land reform, for memory, for return. He died for it, not as a warning, as a symptom. Because Rome, at this point, could no longer go back. Its soul had been outsourced to its armies. Its purpose no longer born from within, but dictated by the edges of the map. To be Roman was not to be from Rome, but to fight for it, die for it, and disappear into its myth. And yet, isn't that what made Rome eternal? Not the stones, not the laws, but this paradox: a civilization obsessed with permanence, building its future on a foundation of endless change. It is here, in the dizzying reach of power, that the Republic stumbles toward its end, not with collapse, but with transformation. A slow turning of the tide, where heroes become tyrants, and the people, weary of freedom, begin to long for command. It will take one man to make that final leap. But before Caesar, before empire, before the Rubicon, Rome had already crossed a line far deeper. It was just a shallow stream, really, no wider than a man could wade. But as Julius Caesar's boots touched the icy edge of the Rubicon, the water turned black with memory and prophecy. This was no mere crossing. This was ritual, a reckoning, a whispered incantation that would unmake a republic and summon an empire. The Senate had commanded him to stop, to disband his legions, to return not as conqueror, but as citizen. But Rome had trained Caesar too well, had taught him ambition in its temples, resilience in its battles, glory in its ruins. When the Republic gave him its sword, it forgot it could not command where it could no longer inspire. And so he crossed. The Rubicon is not famous because of the river. It is famous because of the silence before it. That final breath before transgression. A threshold moment. Caesar paused not from doubt, but from recognition. He knew, perhaps better than any man alive, that Rome could no longer be held together by old rituals and decaying laws. The Republic had become theater, and Caesar, he merely stopped pretending. He marched not only with soldiers, but with symbols. Elephants on coinage, his image carved beside gods, laurels bestowed not by vote, but by victory. The man had become myth, and the myth had found its voice. Every step southward was not a coup, but a confession that Rome no longer trusted its soul to the Senate. But even myths bleed. Rome did not die that day at the Rubicon. It convulsed. It erupted into civil war, not just in fields and provinces, but inside the Roman psyche. Brother against brother. Consul against command. Law against charisma. And watching from their balconies and markets, the Roman people asked themselves, do we want safety or sovereignty? Do we want a father or a forum? The answer came in crimson. Pompey fled. The Senate fractured, and Caesar, the perpetual outsider, became the very center of gravity. He forgave his enemies, reformed the calendar, gave land to veterans, hosted feasts for the poor. But these were not acts of humility. They were declarations of supremacy. The Republic had once made power suspicious. Caesar made it sacred. And yet, even gods can be lonely. On the Ides of March, as blades found his flesh beneath the marble of Pompey's theater, Caesar understood the final irony, that those who carry Rome too tightly in their fist will always be undone by the idea of Rome itself. The Senate struck not out of hatred, but out of fear, not of Caesar the man, but of Caesar the mirror. In him, they saw their own failure to hold a republic together. But the assassination did not resurrect the republic. It embalmed it. Because once the veil was torn, once a man proved that Rome could be ruled not by procedure, but by presence, there was no going back. Augustus would learn from Caesar's shadow. Tread softer. Hide the crown beneath the olive wreath. But the river had already claimed its sacrifice. The Rubicon had already drowned the republic. And still, the question lingers. What after all is Rome? Is it a Senate, a Caesar, a constitution of law, or merely the will to survive, dressed in whatever mask best suits the moment? Perhaps that is the secret of Rome's eternity, not that it resists change, but that it digests it, transforms betrayal into memory, collapse into crown, death into foundation. And so, in the wake of Caesar's fall, Rome prepares once more to be reborn. But a republic does not vanish in a single moment. It unravels slowly, thread by thread, as the ideals that once held it together begin to rot beneath the weight of unchecked power, silent fears, and the myth of exceptional men. After Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Rome became unrecognizable. Not because of fire or siege, but because it no longer remembered what it had once tried to be. It still called itself a republic. The Senate still convened. Laws were still written in careful ink. But in the shadows, in the whispers of patricians and the prayers of the plebs, there was the unmistakable sense that Rome had become something else. And yet, there was no immediate emperor. This is what makes Caesar's Rubicon so tragic. Not because it crowned him a king, but because it proved that no crown was needed. Power had learned how to masquerade in plain clothes. Dictator for 10 years, then for life. Then, silence. The Republic's language still flowed, but its breath was gone. As civil war gave way to uneasy rule, Rome's civic body bore new scars. The names changed: Pharsalus, Thapsus, Munda. Blood smeared across provinces and brothers. And through it all, Caesar's figure loomed like a storm cloud, magnetic, shrewd, theatrical. His enemies fell as much by rumor as by sword. Even Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, became part of the stagecraft. Not just a lover, but an emblem of world conquest, of divine descent, of seduction as sovereignty. Rome watched in wonder and forgot to resist. The Rubicon did not divide Rome from Gaul. It divided Rome from itself. Before, the Republic had prided itself on diffusion. Power scattered like embers across consuls, tribunes, magistrates. But Caesar gathered it like a fisted hand. And with every reform, every pardon, every act of clemency or spectacle, he painted a portrait not of a tyrant, but of a savior. A Rome too tired to govern itself welcomed the illusion of control. One man could decide. One man could save them. One man could be Rome. But beneath this illusion was something darker. Because Caesar did not destroy the Republic. The Republic destroyed itself by making room for Caesar. The very laws designed to protect it had been bent, stretched, softened. First out of fear, then out of convenience, and finally out of habit. When the senators struck him down beneath the statue of Pompey, they weren't killing a despot. They were killing the last reflection of themselves. And Rome mourned not the tyrant, but the security he had promised. His funeral was not somber. It was volcanic. The people rioted. The body burned. The forum echoed with grief and rage. In death, Caesar became more than man. He became inevitable. Augustus would soon rise, careful, composed, cloaked in the language of restoration. But the truth was simpler. The river had already been crossed. The bridge was ash. There would be no return. The Rubicon still flows today. Narrow, unremarkable, forgettable to the eye. But in the memory of civilization, it is a chasm, a warning, a mirror, a myth. It reminds us that the collapse of liberty rarely looks like chaos. More often, it arrives like thunder behind silk, with applause, with order, with the promise of something better. And so we ask, even now, when a city trades its soul for control, is it still Rome? But the gods are not easily fooled, and neither is history. Rome had seen ambition before. It had watched Gracchus bleed for land reform. It had endured Sulla's purges, Catiline's whispers, Pompey's vanity. Yet Caesar was different. Not because he wielded power more violently, but because he did so with velvet fingers and the logic of inevitability. He crossed the Rubicon not as a barbarian storming the gates, but as a Roman reminding his city what it had allowed itself to become. One man did not destroy the Republic. The Republic made him necessary. Even Brutus, the so-called last defender of liberty, struck not from clarity, but from confusion. A man born into the old words, the old ways, trying to preserve a form whose spirit had long since departed. His dagger landed not in Caesar alone, but in the ghost of a system that had already surrendered. And as Caesar fell beneath the shadow of Pompey's statue, his blood soaking the marble feet of a rival long dead, the irony thickened. A republic, forged in defiance of kings, ended not with the coronation of a tyrant, but with the worship of his murder. Because Rome did not rise to avenge his death, it rose to demand more of him. In the chaos that followed, his assassins fled not as liberators, but as fugitives. The people did not cheer. They mourned. They raged. They gathered around the pyre of the fallen general, and in the smoke, they saw not the death of tyranny, but the death of clarity. And that is what made room for Octavian. A boy barely grown, yet shaped like prophecy. Quiet, calculating, masked in filial piety, he spoke of restoration while he quietly dismantled what little remained. The Senate gave him names: Augustus, Princeps, father of the fatherland, but never king, never emperor. Rome had learned to fear those words, so it found new ones. And in that linguistic sleight of hand, the Republic died its second death, quieter, smoother, this time with pageantry and law. Caesar had crossed a river. Augustus turned it into a mirror. One Rome had drowned. Another emerged, radiant and cold, and thus began the greatest masquerade in political history, an empire dressed in republican costume, with temples rebuilt, games revived, and statues of Caesar made divine. The city was reborn. But like all rebirths in Rome, it came with forgetting. What did it mean to be Roman now? To obey, not to debate. To serve, not to dissent. To see in one man the soul of the state. The Rubicon had not merely been crossed. It had become the bloodstream of a new world. A world where the river no longer marked a boundary, but a baptism. And even today, its waters whisper beneath modern soil. Not because we remember Caesar's war, but because we still live in the architecture of his choice. We cross our own Rubicons. In politics, in culture, in conscience. Often without knowing it. Quiet thresholds where governance becomes performance, where freedom wears a crown, and where republics fall not to invasion, but to applause. The question is no longer why Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It is why no one stopped him. They struck at midday. Not in shadow or exile, not in a smoky alley with poison or silence, but in the heart of the state, under marble ceilings, surrounded by senators who once called him savior. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar entered the theater of Pompey, knowing nothing of what would happen, or perhaps knowing everything. Rome had staged its greatest performance yet. And as the conspirators closed in, Brutus among them, his dagger trembling with inheritance, it was not just a man that was being murdered. It was the last illusion of the Republic. The dream they thought they were saving lay already rotted beneath their feet. Their blades did not restore liberty. They pierced only the veneer of order. And out came what had always been buried beneath power without restraint, revenge without boundary. What followed was not a rebirth, but an unmooring. Caesar's body fell, but his spirit multiplied. In the silence after the killing, the killers did not find cheers. They found dread. Rome did not erupt in freedom. It trembled in rage. His funeral became a spectacle of transfiguration. Mark Antony, with rhetorical fire and performance sharpened by ambition, took Caesar's death and turned it into myth. He held aloft the bloodied toga. He showed the wounds. He read the will. He fed the people grief and turned it into fury. Caesar became more than a man. He became a martyr. And then, something more dangerous still, he became an idea. And ideas once loosed from flesh cannot be stabbed. The Forum burned with riot. The Republic cracked into factions. What the assassins forgot was that legitimacy does not live in laws alone, it lives in memory. And Caesar had rewritten Rome's memory with each conquest, each coin stamped with his image, each temple echoing his name. So the aftershocks of the Ides thundered across the world. Brutus and Cassius would flee and fall. The Senate would fracture into impotence. And in the void stepped Octavian, young, pale, unassuming, cloaked in mourning but thinking in centuries. He would avenge Caesar not as a nephew, but as a tactician. He would not raise a sword first, but a symbol. Caesar's comet, blazing across the sky during the funeral games. It was no longer politics. It was prophecy. The star had risen. And with it, the people looked not to the Senate for direction, but to heaven. This was the end of Republican Rome. Not because tyranny won, but because myth triumphed over memory. The dream of shared rule, of debate, of citizen virtue. It had lived too long on the edge of contradiction. The Republic asked for sacrifice from those it excluded. It preached balance while courting expansion. And in the end, it made emperors not from ambition, but from its own collapse. In that collapse, Rome reinvented itself once more. Temples were rededicated, statues recast, and in every marble likeness of Augustus one could still see the ghost of Caesar, eyes serene, posture divine, power absolute, but veiled in republican modesty. The crown had not been placed on the head. It had been dissolved into the air, until all breathed it, until power no longer needed to shout. It merely had to be. Thus, the Republic did not fall with a bang. It unraveled through belief. Belief that a return was possible, that laws alone could hold an empire, that men with daggers could kill what they did not understand. What died on the Ides of March was not Caesar. It was the myth that Rome could survive him. In the weeks that followed Caesar's murder, Rome did not breathe freer air. It inhaled smoke. The city that once rang with speeches and civic ritual now echoed with rumors, revenge lists, and the grinding wheels of armies preparing to march. The assassins, who had imagined themselves the restorers of liberty, found no swelling tide of gratitude. The people grieved not just a leader, but a vision. And in that vacuum, the story of Rome itself began to rewrite its lines. Caesar's ghost did not linger silently. It haunted not just streets and statues, but the imagination of Rome's people. What had once been flesh and flaw was now divine suggestion. Coins bore his profile crowned with laurel. Comets were said to blaze in his honor. Priests consecrated his spirit as Divus Julius, the divine Julius. He had crossed a Rubicon of his own from man to myth. The Senate, meanwhile, crumbled beneath the weight of its own fear. Cicero wrote letters filled with anxious philosophy and desperate hope, but even his words, so often the shield of the Republic, could not conjure back authority. Liberty, when unguarded by power, becomes an echo chamber. Brutus and Cassius, architects of the assassination, fled eastward in search of legions. What they found instead was a truth older than Rome. The crowd does not always cheer for freedom. Sometimes it demands certainty, and certainty came. Not with flourish, but with calculation. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, barely 20, a boy with cold eyes and steady hands, did not storm the gates. He charmed them open. He cloaked his ambition in filial duty, avenging his father with a quiet fury that belied his youth. He joined Mark Antony and Lepidus in a fragile alliance of convenience, the Second Triumvirate. What followed was no noble republic, but the machinery of controlled vengeance. Prosecutions. Property seizures. Even Cicero, whose pen once swayed nations, fell to the blade. Rome was being reborn, not through consensus, but through sacrifice. Blood washed the Forum as thoroughly as any ritual cleansing. And yet, beneath the horror, a new order emerged. Rome did not collapse into chaos. It coalesced around power. Power that no longer hid behind laws but rebranded them. The ideals of the Republic were not discarded. They were embalmed, displayed in public, honored in speech, but hollowed in practice. In this paradox, we see the truest face of the city. Rome did not reject virtue. It performed it. Like theater. Like mask, and so we return to the Senate. Its columns cracked but still standing, its traditions worn like ceremonial armor. The Senate lived on, but its soul no longer guided the state. The center of gravity had shifted, from deliberation to decree, from oration to spectacle. What Rome desired was not merely leadership, but vision embodied, not ideas, but gods in flesh. That is what Caesar became in death. That is what Augustus would master in life. The dream of the Republic was not murdered in a moment. It was mourned across decades, embalmed in speeches, etched into marble. And through that mourning, something new stirred, something imperial, something eternal. Rome had not died, it had molted. The corpse of the Republic was still warm when Octavian stepped through the smoke. He did not thunder like Caesar or burn like Antony. He arrived like a shadow slipping between torches. Quiet, watchful, precise. The world mistook him for a boy. The gods perhaps recognized something older in his gaze. He was not born Augustus. He became him. To most Romans, he was simply Caesar's heir. By blood, yes, but more importantly by narrative. Octavian understood something deeper than battle strategy or political alliance. He understood the theater of power. In the ruins of civil war, where oaths had turned to ash and trust lay strangled in the forum, Augustus crafted not merely a regime but a story, a myth that Rome could believe in again. And belief, in a wounded city, was more precious than gold. He did not seize the Republic. He embalmed it. Layer by layer, he wrapped it in the language of restoration. The Senate still met. Laws were still debated. Temples still smoked with sacrifice. But beneath this familiar choreography, something profound had shifted. The center of power no longer resided in institutions, but in the man who claimed to serve them. He called himself Princeps, first among equals, but the scales knew better. Augustus mastered not the sword, but the pause between wars. Peace itself became his empire. Not merely the absence of conflict, but a designed stillness, an architecture of harmony. Roads stretched from Britannia to Arabia, not just for trade, but for the quiet march of imperial order. He disarmed through awe, ruled through rhythm. This was not the peace of exhaustion. It was the peace of orchestration. What later historians called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was less a truce, more a spell. And like all enchantments, it came at a cost. To create unity, diversity had to be absorbed. Local gods were welcomed, but always under Jupiter's gaze. Provinces were granted privilege, but filtered through Latin tongue and Roman law. Augustus did not erase identities. He swallowed them into a single imperial dream. In exchange, he offered protection, prosperity, legacy. For many, the trade felt fair. For others, it was the price of forgetting. He knew that to rule the future, one must also rule memory. So he rebuilt temples, brick to marble. He revived forgotten rituals. He paraded lineage as prophecy. The image of Rome became not a chaotic republic, but an eternal mother, graced, ordered, divine. He commissioned poets to sing of destiny, sculptors to carve divinity from mortal flesh. Even time bent to his vision, the calendar reformed, his name etched into the very rhythm of years. Augustus became not just emperor but calendar. His reign was not a chapter in history, it was its axis. But if peace was the empire's face, surveillance was its spine. Augustus ruled as much by absence as by presence. He rarely shouted. He did not need to. Power, when rendered mythic, does not raise its voice, it waits. His home on the Palatine Hill was modest by imperial standards, yet that modesty was its own symbol. Simplicity became spectacle. His restraint became a performance of virtue so total, it consumed the possibility of dissent. Who could oppose a man who claimed to oppose only ambition itself? And yet, the contradiction lies bare. Augustus claimed to restore the Republic by becoming the thing it most feared, a monarch in all but name. He ruled for over 40 years, longer than any consul, tribune, or dictator. His word was law, his silence law as well. Even his death was not an end, but a transformation. The Senate declared him a god. Statues of Divus Augustus rose in marketplaces and crossroads, not just in Rome, but from Gaul to Judea. The man had died. The myth had not. In this moment, this great threshold, Rome crossed from republic to empire, from mortal governance to divine pretense. And the people did not resist. They exhaled. Because what Augustus offered was more than order. He offered coherence. After generations of bloodshed, betrayal and civic rupture, he stitched a pattern through the chaos. A Rome that made sense. A Rome that endured. But peace, as ever, is not a destination. It is a mask. Beneath the marble, the fractures remained. Beneath the prayers, ambition stirred. Beneath the golden age, shadows grew long. Augustus built a Rome that could not question him. And in doing so, he built an empire that could not question itself. But peace, in Rome, was never merely the stillness after war. It was an edifice, a performance, a sculpture carved from silence and fear. Augustus had ended the bloodletting, yes. But he had done so by mastering the choreography of contradiction, cloaking absolute power in the garments of humility, and presenting continuity while orchestrating rupture. He called it the Principate, not monarchy. He said he restored the Republic, not abolished it. But what is restoration, when the thing restored no longer breathes? The Senate still met, but its thunder had become whisper. The consuls still wore their robes, but their shadows no longer reached the Palatine. There, on that sacred hill, Augustus held court not in gold and grandeur, but with marble restraint. His house modest, his manner calculated. It was the image of republican virtue, weaponized to entrench imperial reality. Augustus understood that power, to endure, must feel invisible, like gravity or time. So he fashioned himself as the first citizen, the princeps, not king, a servant of the people who held all the reins. He stood before the Roman world not as tyrant, but as a living paradox, the man who ruled everything by claiming to rule nothing. And it worked. Because what the people craved was not liberty. They had watched liberty devour itself in the streets, on the blades of conspirators, in the endless theater of civil war. What they hungered for was predictability, rhythm, the safety of pattern. And Augustus gave them time. Literally, he revised the calendar, inserted his name into the months, calibrated the passage of years to the cadence of his own presence. The empire ticked to his breath. Temples rose to honor him beside the gods, and yet he kept his sandals dusted with the illusion of humility. His image was everywhere, on coin, on marble, in verse, but it did not shout. It whispered, constantly. And in that whisper, Rome became something else. It became architecture, it became law, it became story. Augustus was not merely a man, he was a mechanism, a cultural clockwork that aligned power, art, religion, and myth into one imperial symphony. He knew that to sculpt eternity you must first sculpt memory. So he elevated Virgil to write the Aeneid, not just an epic, but a genealogy, a prophecy in reverse, a Rome where the blood of Trojans flowed into Italian soil, destined to culminate in Augustus himself. It was not just political flattery. It was identity making. Rome had not merely won wars, it had always been meant to. Fate had spoken, and Augustus was its punctuation. But behind the verses, behind the statues and columns and golden eagles, there was still breath, still human cost. The provinces now moved to a single drumbeat. But who set the tempo? Who suffered the tightening of control in the name of peace? The legions marched, not to expand, but to maintain. And in maintaining, they subdued. The imperial border became not a line but a pulse, a perimeter of pressure. Every village that accepted the Roman peace also accepted its architecture, roads, baths, gods. Every city that praised Augustus carved a little less of itself into its stones, and a little more of him. Peace, yes, but not stillness. It was a machine, oiled by order, humming with surveillance. Yet within that machinery, there was awe. The forum glistened anew. Aqueducts brought the mountains into the city. Marble replaced brick. Festivals bloomed, sacrifices rose in fragrant smoke, and Rome began to believe in itself again. Not as a place, but as a principle. As a mirror of the cosmos, orderly and enduring. Augustus had not saved the Republic. He had replaced it with a dream more seductive, that Rome could be eternal, if only it forgot how to change. And so the first emperor died not as a villain, but as a god, apotheosized. His soul said to rise to the heavens as a star. His mausoleum welcomed successors, imitators, and eventually us. Centuries later, still tracing our fingers along his legacy, wondering whether peace born of silence is peace at all. Because in Augustus, Rome did not just become an empire. It became the story it would forever try to believe. Beneath the marble hush of empire, something extraordinary stirred, a silence so orchestrated it sang. Not of absence, but of presence too vast to question. This was not the peace of still water. It was the peace of a sky carved with eagles, of coins etched with gods who now bore Roman faces, of time itself reshaped to orbit a single city. Rome had conquered the world. But to make that conquest eternal, it needed a script, a myth not just told, but built, written in stone, in ritual, in blood. This was the Pax Romana, not merely a political lull between conquests, but a curated state of mind. It was the empire's most delicate invention, a peace so luminous it concealed the mechanisms of control beneath it. A peace that said what came before was chaos. What surrounds you now is order. Worship it, and Rome did. From Londinium to Palmyra, from the Nile to the Rhine, cities were refashioned not just in layout, but in memory. Forums mimicked the mother city. Temples bore the faces of emperors who became gods not after death, but during life. The imperial cult did not beg belief, it demanded participation. Processions, festivals, oaths of loyalty. Augustus had set the precedent, his successors chiseled it deeper with every passing decade. The message was clear: Rome did not merely conquer territories. It conquered time, it conquered truth. On every frontier, the legions ensured that tribute flowed inward. But more dangerous than the spears were the statues. They arrived by ship and caravan. Images of emperors in bronze and marble, draped in the language of eternity. They stood in forums, in markets, in sanctuaries. They did not need to speak. Their stillness was command enough. And within the empire, poets, historians, sculptors, and architects became instruments of the same agenda. Livy rewrote the early centuries as a moral ascent. Virgil traced the bloodline of Augustus back to Aeneas. Ovid was exiled for art that danced too freely. Even the gods were conscripted. Jupiter now shared his throne with Rome. Mars shed his primal rage to father civilization. Venus, mother of the Julian line, smiled down from temples designed to mirror the heavens. Propaganda. The word feels too thin. This was theology by architecture, theology by city planning, theology by bureaucracy. Every road that led to Rome also led the traveler inward, to an idea of power so grand, it began to erase the boundary between myth and memory. But here, in the gleam of triumph, a quiet dissonance began to form. If Rome was so eternal, why did it feel the need to remind everyone? Why did its emperors commission mosaics that showed them triumphing over barbarians who had already submitted? Why did victory arches multiply after wars barely won? Why did official histories omit civil wars, betrayals, poisonings, and amplify omens, portents, divine signs? Because power is most fragile when it has too much to protect. And so the empire wrote itself over and over, like a child tracing the same letter into stone until the groove became a trench. In this trench, contradictions hid. Cities starved while temples glistened. Slaves built aqueducts for citizens who would never know their names. Senators praised emperors with trembling voices as statues of liberty watched in silence. Still, the illusion endured, because it wasn't entirely a lie. There was magnificence, colosseums that breathed thunder, libraries that guarded the thoughts of 3 continents, roads that webbed a known world. Peace of a kind did exist. Bandits were fewer. Markets flourished. A peasant in Gaul could drink from a fountain engineered in Rome. That mattered. It still does. But the cost of that miracle was forgetting that this empire had once been a republic, that its founders had once loathed kings, that its soul had once debated in open forums, rather than whispered in corridors of marble and fear. Pax Romana was real, but so was the pressure it required. So was the fear that it could end. And so Rome wrote itself harder, deeper, louder, until the myth of permanence became heavier than the structures that held it, until the weight of peace began to crack the very stones it was carved into. But eternity, once written, must be defended, first by narrative, then by silence. The further Rome extended this illusion of peace, the more carefully it edited the story behind it. Dissent became distortion. Collapse became transition, and history, true, raw, ruptured history, became clay in the hands of imperial scribes. Even time itself bent to the empire's will. In ABCE, the Roman calendar was reformed once again, not only to correct the drift of seasons, but to center the very measurement of existence around the deeds of Rome's rulers. The calendar was no longer just a tool of farmers and priests. It was an altar of propaganda. Months bore imperial names. Years were counted from the founding of the city, as if history had no origin before Rome. This was the architecture of memory itself. And in this carefully manicured memory, the emperor stood alone at the center, no longer first among equals, but living symbol. His image multiplied across coins, amphorae, mosaics, and murals. His profile, etched by artisans who would never see his face, became more familiar to subjects than the faces of their own kin. The emperor became the axis of the world, omnipresent, if not omnipotent. Yet for all this visual saturation, the system was delicate, balancing power on the blade of perception. Because while Rome declared its peace eternal, it was perpetually haunted by what it refused to name. Barbarians at the borders, senators whispering behind drapes, generals dreaming under foreign stars. And so Rome didn't just write itself into eternity, it rehearsed eternity daily. Every triumphal march, every staged sacrifice, every recited lineage and glowing decree. The empire became a theater of repetition, where ritual blurred into reality and politics became religion. But this performance bore a cost. Behind the facades, beneath the statues, a question lingered, one too dangerous to speak aloud: what happens when the empire forgets it is acting? Because peace, when untethered from truth, begins to rot from the inside. The signs were subtle at first. Grain shortages in Egypt whispered through censored streets. Mutinies drowned in coin before they reached the capital. Whole cities silenced by generous gods. But each new monument, each lavish bathhouse, each amphitheater funded by provincial taxes, was a stone laid over fracture. Rome became a body so adorned with gold it could no longer feel its wounds. And still, it claimed wholeness, claimed order, claimed destiny. The tragedy of empire is not just that it lies, but that eventually it believes the lie. Rome had once been a city of argument, its soul forged in contest between patricians and plebeians, senate and tribune, virtue and ambition. Now it was a city of mirrors. Wherever one turned, it reflected the same perfection, the same face, the same script. This was the price of the Pax Romana, not just the suppression of rebellion, but the stilling of imagination, the silencing of alternatives, and yet the myth endured. Because the myth worked, people lived longer, roads stretched farther, aqueducts brought water to arid soil, laws were codified, cultures preserved. Trade flourished in lands where once only raiders rode. The Roman peace may have been gilded in illusion, but it was not empty. So the empire carried forward, heavy with its own splendor, burdened by the weight of being divine. But eternity, once written, cannot pause. And already, from the edges of its endless map, new stories gathered, carried by winds from the north, stirring in the deserts of the east, whispers the monuments could not mute, beliefs the legions could not convert, forces no amount of marble could contain. Rome had written itself into the stars. But stars, too, eventually collapse. He dreamed in marble and burned in myth. In the smoldering heart of Rome, where once the Forum echoed with senatorial thunder and the gods were fed in orderly piety, a boy emperor raised a stage. Not a days of politics, but a theater of self, arched and golden, drenched in perfume and illusion. Nero, last of the Claudians, heir to both divine mandate and familial madness, stood not merely as ruler but as Rome personified, fractured, flamboyant, unpredictable, and haunted by its own image. The fire that consumed Rome in 64 CE did more than devour wood and stone. It exposed the dry timber of imperial identity. Flames tore through insulae and temples, but they also illuminated the architecture of propaganda. While the people wailed in the streets, Nero, cloaked in rumor, was said to perform an epic on his private stage, singing of the fall of Troy as the new Troy ignited behind him. Did he play the lyre as the city burned? Perhaps. But more enduring than the truth was the spectacle. Nero's power did not rest in mere conquest. It pulsed through theater. His reign was a performance, his life a script, his empire a captive audience. And Rome, so expert in exporting myth, found itself trapped in one. He rebuilt the city not with reverence, but with narcissism. At the center of the new Rome rose his Domus Aurea, the golden hausa, a villa, palace vast enough to swallow neighborhoods, ringed with colonnades and mechanical ceilings that rained perfume. A rotating dining room spun like the cosmos itself, with Nero at its axis. He who had once promised to restore Rome now remodeled it in his image. But here was the rupture. Nero's Rome did not believe in restraint. Its peace had become performance. Its emperor, a mask of god and monster, of poet and executioner. And in that performance lay a deeper fear, that the gods had withdrawn, and all that remained was theater. Seneca, the philosopher who once guided the boy king's conscience, watched in silence as that conscience unraveled. Power untethered from virtue became farce, then terror. The executions grew more erratic, the exiles multiplied, even beauty became a weapon, sculpted, sung, sold to a public increasingly unable to distinguish poetry from policy. The Golden House itself became a metaphor for empire excessive, hollow, dazzling by design. Rome was no longer a republic reborn, nor even an empire assured. It was a mirror, fractured but gilded, reflecting whatever face the emperor wore that day. And beneath this spectacle festered rage. When the conspiracies came, they were not born of revolution but exhaustion. The Senate no longer schemed to restore virtue, but to survive humiliation. Nero's end did not arrive in blaze or banner, but in desertion. Even the Praetorians, those loyal guardians of imperial presence, turned their backs. Abandoned, hunted, he fled the stage he had built, whispering his final line not to the gods, but to the myth itself. What an artist dies in me. It was not merely the end of a ruler. It was the collapse of Rome's illusion that one man could embody the city's soul without destroying it. Yet the ruins of Nero's Rome did not vanish. They were buried beneath new stones, and the Golden House was carved into memory by erasure. Baths would be built atop its opulence. Statues melted, inscriptions chiseled into silence. Rome attempted to forget him. But it could not, because Nero's reign, however monstrous, revealed a truth the marble tried to conceal: that power, when it ceases to serve anything beyond itself, becomes performance without audience, art without anchor. It devours history and replaces it with hallucination. In the decades that followed, emperors would rise and fall with swords and scrolls in hand, but always with one eye on the crowd. The theater had become inseparable from the throne. The soul of Rome was no longer in the Senate or the sword. It pulsed through architecture, through rumor, through gesture and spectacle. Power now depended on the stage upon which it was seen. And still, behind every golden facade, the fire lingered, waiting. But what if the fire had always been there, smoldering not in the timber of Rome's crowded alleyways, but in the bloodstream of its ambition? For all the scandal that history heaps upon Nero, it is not merely his cruelty that echoes, but his genius for illusion. He understood, perhaps too well, that Rome was no longer just a city or a government. It was a stage. And to rule it was to direct its myth. From the moment he took the throne, Nero twisted power into performance. He abandoned the cold marble mask of stoic emperorship and stepped into the flickering torchlight as artist, charioteer, seducer of crowds. He sang before thousands. He acted on public stages. He turned the imperial gaze not outward, to borders or battles, but inward, to spectacle, to symbolism, to self. The sword still hung at Rome's belt, but it was the mirror it held to its own face that now cut deepest. The Domus Aurea, his infamous golden house, was not just a palace. It was a reimagining of empire itself, a dwelling fit not for a mortal emperor but for a sun god. Gardens bled into halls. Water danced down marbled channels like veins of opulence. At its heart stood a colossal bronze statue, Nero's soul, radiant and eternal. It was obscene, it was magnificent, and it terrified the Senate, because they knew if Rome believed this theater long enough, if marble lies replaced memory, then Nero would not just rule Rome, he would become it. Yet the fire, real or imagined, fractured that illusion. Whether sparked by accident, order, or omen, it charred the facades of the old republic and left behind ash pregnant with paranoia. The people, stripped of shelter, turned not only on their emperor, but on the very idea of performance as politics. In retaliation, Nero played his final, fatal role, that of divine avenger. He blamed the Christians, still a shadowed sect, strange and unprotected, and unleashed horrors so baroque they bled into legend. They were burned alive as living torches, crucified in rows, fed to beasts. Here was Rome's mask at its darkest, when grandeur morphed into grotesque, and the need for control eclipsed all human measure. But cruelty cannot hold a city, nor can illusion. Nero's Rome cracked not beneath rebellion, but beneath disbelief. As the provinces revolted and generals declared war on his name, even his closest guards abandoned their scripts. Alone, Nero fled to a villa, where he begged for a servant to help him die. The voice that once echoed through amphitheaters now quivered in the shadows. Qualis artifex purio. What an artist dies in me. Yet the artist did not die, not fully. He was buried, yes, reviled, yes. His name chiseled from arches. His statues shattered. His golden house smothered beneath public baths. But even buried, Nero lingered. In rumor, in Rome's soul, in the uneasy truth that empire and theater had fused so tightly they could no longer be pulled apart. And that is the deeper ache of Nero's reign. Not simply his madness, but what it revealed, that Rome, for all its laws and legions, was now addicted to appearance. That the gods no longer thundered from the heavens, they whispered from stagecraft and stone. Centuries later, Christian poets would recast Nero as the Antichrist. Artists would paint him not in marble but in shadow. He became Rome's phantom twin, the ghost in the golden corridors, laughing between acts. Because once the city learned it could be ruled by myth, it never unlearned it. Even now, when we walk beneath the Colosseum's bone, white arches, or trace the mosaic fragments of a vanished dining room, we're not just witnessing ruin. We're watching the curtain fall on a civilization, still unsure if it was empire, dream, or performance. And the fire, it never truly died. It moved inward, into the imagination of power, the spectacle of politics, the burning need to believe. In the wake of fire and farce, a quieter empire began to breathe. Gone were the megalomaniacal flourishes of Nero's theater, the glittering palaces built more for performance than posterity. In their place is stone, discipline, reflection. Rome, still drunk from spectacle, found itself sobered by philosophy. What followed was not merely stability, it was aspiration turned inward. For nearly a century, a line of emperors emerged not from bloodline or brute force, but by adoption, chosen, not born, a radical idea even by today's measure. 5 men, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, became stewards not of their own glory, but of Rome's soul. Each stood as a threshold. Each, in his own way, posed the same eternal question. What does it mean to rule wisely? They did not silence the violence. Rome's legions still thundered across frontiers. Slaves still groaned under columns. The Senate still postured in marbled halls. But beneath it all, a different current moved, an attempt, however fragile, to align power with thought, conquest with conscience. Trajan marched farther than any emperor before him. From Dacia to Mesopotamia, his armies carved the horizon into Rome's image. Yet it is not the blood of his wars that survives. It is the column that spirals upward in his name, a scroll of stone, winding skyward like the ambition of the state itself. Victory reimagined not in gore, but in narrative, in remembrance. Hadrian, the builder emperor, turned the empire's gaze inward. He drew boundaries where ambition had once demanded expansion. He walked the provinces with the wariness of one who knew that walls do more than divide. They define. His wall in Britain, his temple to Venus in Rome, his love for Greek art, all echo a man who tried to sculpt not just space, but identity. And then came Marcus, stoic, solemn, suffering. an emperor who kept a philosopher's diary beside his sword. While barbarians tested the empire's edges and plague hollowed its streets, Marcus Aurelius wrote meditations not for others, but for himself. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he told himself, as armies broke camp and death came closer. This was the paradox of the philosopher king. He ruled a world he could not control. But instead of chasing illusion, he embraced mortality. He reigned not from Olympus, but from the battlefield and the bedside. His empire was not just land, it was interior, internal, moral. And yet, even these good emperors, praised by generations, carved in statues, quoted in wisdom, could not escape the shadow they walked beneath. Their virtues were fragile, provisional. Each one was followed not by another philosopher, but by an heir less noble, less wise. Marcus gave way to Commodus. The candle of Stoicism passed into a carnival of vanity. Again the cycle returned. Rome dreamed of gods, gave birth to men, and inherited monsters. Still, this brief golden arc remains a haunting mirror. A glimpse, perhaps, of what empire might have been. Not just domination or decadence, but stewardship. Thought. A republic of the spirit wrapped in imperial robes. Their legacy does not lie in territory, but in temperament. In the aching effort to govern not only others, but oneself. In the belief, radical then, radical now, that power without virtue is a ruin in waiting. In the silence of their statues, in the wind that brushes the meditations across centuries, there is a question that refuses to die. Can wisdom survive sovereignty? Rome asked. The world still answers. But even the clearest marble casts a shadow when the light changes. As the century of the 5 good emperors neared its close, the gleam of their legacy began to dull, not from failure, but from the very weight of their virtue. Perfection or its illusion breeds expectation. And in empire, expectation is a dangerous seed. It grows not just into hope, but entitlement and rot. Beneath the surface of stoic wisdom and marble harmony, contradictions deepened. The empire was unified, yes, but also strained. The borders, once held by Trajan's confidence and Hadrian's prudence, had become brittle outlines haunted by barbarians and ghosts. Wealth flowed inward, but unevenly, its tributaries diverted by corruption, greed, and silence. And the Senate, once a partner in philosophical rule, had grown ornamental, more echo than voice. The paradox sharpened. The more the emperors governed with reason, the more Rome expected gods. And gods do not die, but emperors do. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the last of the 5, did not adopt a successor as his predecessors had. He entrusted the empire to his son. A return to blood, to dynasty, to the ancient instinct that rule must flow through veins rather than minds. His name was Commodus, a name history would not forgive. With that choice, the dream began to bend. Commodus inherited an empire but not a philosophy. He wore the skin of Hercules in the arena, battled gladiators like a spectacle, hungry Nero reborn, and called himself the new founder of Rome. A child of marble thrones who preferred the roar of crowds over the quiet weight of introspection. In a single generation, the Stoic experiment collapsed into theater. A century of restraint unraveled not in conquest or rebellion, but in performance. The empire no longer whispered wisdom, it shouted myth. And yet, perhaps that too was inevitable. A cycle not of failure, but recurrence. For what is Rome, if not this eternal struggle between power and philosophy, show and soul? The 5 good emperors were not the pinnacle of Roman civilization. They were its breath held in suspension. A moment of contemplative stillness between storms. A pause when empire remembered it had a mind as well as a sword. But pauses end, still, their echo lingers. In letters carved on ruined temples. In Marcus' words scribbled under torchlight on the cold frontiers of Germania. In the haunting idea that there was once an empire ruled by men who tried, however imperfectly, to be more than conquerors. What if that brief golden century wasn't an exception, but a question? Can greatness be chosen, not inherited? Can empire serve something other than itself? And in the ruins of their legacy, can we still hear a whisper? Not of what Rome was, but of what it dared to imagine. It did not begin with a bang, nor a single blade. The fracturing of Rome was not announced from a palace or battlefield. It began, as so many undoings do, with silence. Hairline cracks beneath painted ceilings, cold drafts in once sacred halls, murmurs in forgotten provinces where the eagle no longer soared, only lingered in memory. The walls came first. Hadrian's wall in the north, the limes in the east, barriers not just of stone but of spirit. These were not monuments to glory, but admissions of uncertainty. Rome, once a boundless hunger, was drawing its lines, not to expand, but to survive. Its borders hardened like old scars, reminders of where the empire had bled and could bleed again. Then came the plagues. Invisible armies swept through marble streets and remote garrisons alike, no respect for gods or emperors. the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Cyprian. Names etched into chronicles like shadows falling across the sun. What they left behind were not just corpses, but absences, missing farmers, vanished tax collectors, hollowed temples. Entire generations were swallowed, not by swords, but by fever and breathless silence. And in that silence, something shifted. The myth of invincibility, that sacred fiction woven into every banner and bathhouse, began to fray. Rome was no longer the world's axis. It was a weight. Diocletian saw the fracture and tried to bind it with precision. He split the empire in two, east and west, not as a defeat, but a strategy of survival. Two emperors, two courts, two suns orbiting the same fading flame. But in dividing Rome, he unwittingly summoned a question that would haunt centuries. Can something be saved by becoming something else? His reforms were architectural, bureaucratic, reforms of calendar and coin, of office and oath. But the soul of the empire, frayed and ghost-like, could not be codified. It could only be remembered. And memory, like empire, is fragile. As fortresses rose, cities shrank. Aurelian built the great walls around Rome itself, not to boast, but to defend. For the first time in centuries, the eternal city feared it might not be eternal. Barbarians were no longer distant phantoms. They had names, tactics, alliances. And sometimes they were hired by Rome herself. Mercenaries turned saviors, turned threats. Even language fractured. Latin twisted into dialects. Gods once shared by every corner of the empire now competed in whispers and riots. Christianity, once persecuted, began its slow ascent to dominion, not as a religion of rebellion, but as an instrument of order. Rome, the old goddess of roads and reason, now made room for the cross. And still, the city endured. But endurance is not the same as triumph. By the 4th century, emperors no longer walked barefoot into the Forum. They ruled from Ravenna or Constantinople, palaces at the edge of the map. Rome, the city, had become a relic of itself, venerated, visited, bypassed. Its senate still sat, but its voice was hollow. Its temples still stood, but their gods had fled. And yet, the stones remembered. Because Rome had always been more than its senate, its Caesars, its borders. It was an idea with the weight of mountains. An idea that even as it cracked, refused to crumble. But ideas, like marble, do not fall all at once. They weather, they shift. They echo. And so Rome entered its twilight not in dramatic collapse, but in the slow twilight of division. East from west, gods from emperors, soul from skin. The civilization that once conquered the world had now turned inward. Its greatest threat not from without, but from the splitting of its own self. The center could not hold, or perhaps it had simply moved. But even as Rome splintered, a strange truth emerged from its fissures. The city's memory grew stronger as its body weakened. In the very moment Rome began to dissolve as a geopolitical entity, it began to crystallize as myth, as symbol, as sacred inheritance. And perhaps that is the most Roman of all paradoxes, that to fracture is not always to fall. Sometimes it is to multiply. In the East, Constantinople would rise not as a rival, but as an echo. Constantine the Great, crowned in legend and bathed in divine favor, repositioned the soul of empire toward the Bosporus. A new Rome, brighter, Christian, invincible in imagination, claimed the legacy of the old without sharing its vulnerabilities. Yet behind the golden mosaics the questions endured. Was this rebirth or betrayal? Was Rome a place or a possession? In the West, the answer came not with renewal, but with retreat. Emperors dwindled into puppets. Barbarians were no longer at the gates. They were on the thrones. Visigoths in the halls of marble. Vandals crossing the sea. The sack of 410 by Alaric did not just shock the world, it unmasked it. Rome was not untouchable. It could bleed. It could burn. But even the flames did not consume its idea, because long before it lost its armies, Rome had already become something no sword could cut, a vision. A cathedral of law and ritual, of story and ruin, of broken stone laced with meaning. The Roman Forum, once the beating heart of the Republic, had quieted. Yet in its silence, the voice of the past rang louder than ever. Each shattered arch, each weed-choked column whispered not of finality, but of recurrence, of cycles, of eternal returns. It was no longer about borders. It was about imagination. Christian bishops began to claim what Caesars could not. The Church, once persecuted by emperors, now preserved the name of Rome like a relic. Papal Rome emerged not as a continuation of imperial might, but as a wreath sanctification of space. Latin endured not as a tool of conquest, but as a language of salvation. And the ruins, they became pilgrimage. In this twilight, a new kind of power emerged, one that did not need armies or legions, but memory, myth, and miracle. The city turned inward, its outer provinces abandoned, but its soul, now spiritual, now eternal, unfurled across generations. Rome, once sculptor of the world, became its relic, and from relics new civilizations are born, Because collapse, in Rome, was never only an ending. It was a rite, a descent into shadow from which something else, altered but awake, could rise. And so, while emperors faded and generals fell, the idea of Rome, that grand, conflicted mirror of human striving, endured. It outlasted its palaces, outlasted its gods, outlasted even itself, not because it never died, but because it kept becoming. In the slow dawn of the 4th century, as Rome staggered beneath the weight of its own enormity, a man stood poised to redraw the very nature of the empire, not with conquest, but with a revelation. His name was Constantine, and in his shadow the centuries began to bend. He was not born into power, nor was he carved in marble. He emerged from the blood-slick churn of civil war, son of a tetrarch, heir to ambition, carried by legions and omens. But Constantine was not just another contender for a broken crown. He was something stranger, more dangerous, a man who dreamed not only of empire, but of eternity. According to the story, told, retold, polished into legend, Constantine looked to the heavens before battle and saw a symbol, a cross of light, radiant above the midday sky, inscribed with the words in hoc signo vinces. In this sign you will conquer. Whether this moment was vision or propaganda, miracle or maneuver, it did what Rome had always done best. It transformed belief into a weapon, and a weapon into rule. The old gods, once housed in marble temples and bound by civic ritual, began to fade beneath the weight of this new celestial empire. Jupiter gave way to Jesus. The Vestal fire flickered as catacombs rose into cathedrals. And at the center of this pivot stood Constantine, not merely as emperor, but as architect of a theological Rome, where sword and scripture entwined. He would baptize the empire, but not until his deathbed. He would favor the church, but never kneel to it. Constantine's genius lay in ambiguity. He did not tear down the imperial mythos. He repurposed it, wrapped the divine in purple robes, draped Christianity in the folds of Roman authority. And in doing so, he invented a new kind of emperor, part Augustus, part apostle. But this transformation came at a cost, a fracture between the earthly and the eternal, the civic and the sacred. Rome was no longer merely a city or a senate or even a law. It was now an idea stretched between heaven and earth, claimed by bishops, invoked by emperors, but belonging to neither. The throne now shared space with the altar, and both would vie, in centuries to come, for ultimate dominion. To cement this rupture, Constantine did the unthinkable. He built a second Rome. Far from the crumbling rituals of the Forum, on the lip of the Bosporus, rose Constantinople, a new capital, gilded and defensible, draped in Christian icons, yet echoing imperial symmetry. It was both continuity and departure. The body of empire had shifted east, while its soul was still negotiating its identity. This was not merely geography. It was theology in stone. The move declared that Rome was not confined to soil. It could travel, transcend, shape shift. But in this mobility, something essential was lost. The Rome of Romulus and Remus, of Cicero and Caesar, began to recede like a fading constellation. What replaced it was more eternal, but also less human. In the frescoes of the Lateran, Constantine kneels, offering a model of the city not to the people, but to God. Here was the new pact, power no longer derived from the Senate, nor even the sword, but from a higher mandate. Empire had become sanctified. And once power claims heaven as its witness, contradiction deepens its roots. For what is divine rule if not unchallengeable? What is sacred empire if not a mask for absolutism? The city as soul, once torn between its pagan ghosts and philosophical rigor, was now cloaked in absolutes. Doubt, that vital Roman virtue, the doubt that forged law, that tempered ambition, that wrestled with meaning, was declared heresy. And yet, behind the icons and incense, Rome remained Rome. Bureaucratic, strategic, self-preserving. Constantine did not destroy the empire. He baptized it in ambiguity and left it to survive or dissolve in its own contradictions. Thus began a Rome that was less about what it ruled, and more about what it represented. A Rome of invisible lines, between East and West, Caesar and Christ, throne and truth. And in this split, the seeds of future collapse and reinvention were quietly planted. But what happens when a symbol becomes too large for its skin? When Constantine split the Roman soul, between the sword and the spirit, between the temple and the cross, he didn't just redirect the empire, he detonated it into dualities. The consequences were not immediate, but they were tectonic. With every cathedral consecrated, with every imperial edict draped in divine authority, a question festered. Could Rome truly serve two masters, God and Caesar? That fracture deepened with each year. Bishops gathered in councils, debating not just dogma but dominion. Who had the right to speak for God, and who had the might to enforce it? The emperor once stood alone in purple, flanked by legionaries. Now, He stood beside altars, beside men in white robes holding texts more powerful than swords. Rome, once a city of marble myths and political theater, had wandered into metaphysical terrain. It no longer ruled merely land. It sought to govern belief. But belief is volatile. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be drafted. And it resists being told where to dwell. In the aftermath of Constantine's vision, civil war wore new masks. Theologies became battle lines. Emperors declared orthodoxy by decree, and those who dissented were not just rebels. They were heretics. The old imperial enemy, the barbarian at the gate, was now joined by a subtler danger, the splintering within. The Edict of Milan had promised peace, but unity bred schism. Rome could no longer enforce a single story, and an empire that cannot agree on its story is an empire already unraveling. Even the architecture began to mirror this transformation. Gone were the triumphal arches, crowning the roads of conquest. In their place, domed basilicas wombed like an introspective, built not to intimidate the outside world but to contain a sacred silence. Statues of emperors gave way to icons of saints. And yet, both gazed with the same unblinking authority. This was no longer the Rome of iron and aqueducts. This was a Rome of relics and ritual, incense and invocation. A city both haunted and hallowed. But in trying to eternalize itself through sanctity, Rome began to lose its grasp on the practical. The legions thinned. The borders blurred. Administration collapsed into infighting. And in the east, Constantinople rose like a mirror. Brighter, younger, more devout, but still carrying the same Roman bones beneath its Byzantine silk. By the late 4th century, the Western Empire began to buckle beneath contradictions it could no longer reconcile. Pagan senators still clung to fading rites, while Christian emperors waged war against their own. In this schizophrenic swirl, even time itself fractured, one Rome facing Jerusalem, the other still echoing Jupiter's thunder. And then came Theodosius. He was the last man to rule both east and west. A brief reunion, flickering like a dying constellation. Under him, paganism was finally outlawed. The temple of Vesta went cold. The eternal fire, tended for 1,000 years, was snuffed by decree. That moment wasn't just political. It was psychic. It marked the closing of a door. Rome, the mortal city of gods, had been replaced by Rome, the immortal idea of one. But even as statues were toppled, and temples were stripped, and scrolls burned in the name of purity, a truth whispered from the rubble: no empire kills its past. It merely buries it in new robes. And so, beneath every cross etched on a Roman wall, the echo of the old gods murmured still. Beneath every proclamation of divine unity, the fault lines of ambition, pride, and survival widened. Constantine had sought to save Rome by sanctifying it. But in doing so, he had cast it adrift, between faith and empire, between heaven and earth. Rome was no longer just a city, or even a civilization. It had become a contradiction, and contradictions do not end. They endure. It did not fall in a single night. It fell like a breath leaves the body, gradually, then completely. When the Visigoths breached the walls of Rome in 410 CE, it was not the first time the city had been threatened, but it was the first time in 800 years that it had been taken. And for the people of the empire, Roman or not, Christian or pagan, patrician or plebeian, it was an unthinkable thing, like watching the sun extinguish mid-sky. What collapsed was not just a city, it was a story. Rome, the eternal, had proven mortal. But even in that mortality, something stirred. Let us step into that night with haunted eyes. The streets that once echoed with the boots of triumph now shuddered under the weight of foreign rage. The Senate House, the temples, the mansions of the Palatine, all desecrated, plundered, reduced from myth to matter. And yet the sack was not obliteration. It was theater, symbol. Warning. The Goths did not raze the city to ash. They did something stranger. They honored its ghost. Alaric marched through the gates not to destroy Rome, but to wear it, to parade through its sacred spaces with the strange reverence of a barbarian who had grown up dreaming Roman dreams. For even the destroyers knew Rome was not simply walls and columns. It was an idea wrapped in marble skin. And that idea, though wounded, did not die. It echoed. St. Augustine heard that echo in North Africa, where panicked Romans cried out, how could a Christian empire fall? He responded not with despair, but with a vision. The city of God, a realm not built by emperors but by faith, untouchable by flame or sword. In his words, a new Rome was born, not on the Tiber, but in theology. This was the pivot. Rome ceased being a place. It became a pilgrimage, an inheritance. A paradox bloomed: the more Rome crumbled in stone, the more eternal it became in spirit. Monks in distant monasteries began copying Latin texts, preserving Roman law, logic, and letters with ink and prayer. Barbarian kings styled themselves consuls, senators, even Caesars. In Gaul, in Hispania, in the shadowed forests of Germania, rulers spoke Latin even as they carved new dialects from its bones. Rome had been sacked, but it had not been silenced. Its language, its law, its memory were smuggled through the centuries, not as static relics, but as seeds. And like seeds, they would crack before blooming. The Western Empire fractured. Its roads grew over with weeds. Its aqueducts ran dry. Its emperors shrank into puppets, then disappeared altogether. But something uncanny occurred no matter who claimed the throne, or the rubble beneath it. They invoked Rome. In Constantinople, emperors still called themselves Roman, though the West had fallen. In Ravenna, mosaics of Justinian gleamed in Byzantine gold, preserving an image of order amid chaos. And in faraway Britain, ruins of bathhouses and colonnades whispered stories to people who no longer remembered the Republic, but still built in its shadow. Because Rome had taught the world how to imagine power, how to inscribe glory in stone, how to make monuments whisper, even after silence fell. Even the Church, now ascendant, owed its bones to the empire it outlived. The Pope called himself Pontifex Maximus. The Vatican stood on the bones of Nero's racetrack, and every procession down the nave echoed the pageantry of imperial Rome. Robes, incense, Latin chants. The divine republic replacing a worldly one. The sacking of Rome was not the end. It was a torch passed. A fire smoldering beneath the ashes of history, waiting for new architects to gather the embers. And they would. Charlemagne would kneel to be crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 CE. Renaissance scholars would scour dusty libraries, searching for Cicero, for Livy, for the lost rhythms of Roman thought. And Mussolini, centuries later, would strut among ruins, invoking the Third Rome, with fascist theater. All illusions, all shadows cast by an empire long dead but never buried. Because Rome was not built in a day, and it did not die in one. It was sacked, but not silenced. Its voice became many voices. Its face, 1,000 masks. And in every age that followed, someone would look into the broken mirror of its memory and ask, what was Rome? The answer, as ever, would shift. But the asking, that never stopped. What if an empire could dream? After the Western Empire dissolved into whispers and ruins, the world should have turned the page. But it did not. Instead, the story deepened, shifted eastward, shimmered into gold and mosaic. Rome did not die, it migrated. And it reawakened on the Bosporus. Byzantium, once a Greek colony, reborn as Constantinople, did not merely inherit Rome's mantle. It clothed itself in its soul. It spoke Greek, yes, but called itself Roman. Its emperors crowned themselves Basilius Tun Romaean, Emperor of the Romans. Its laws stemmed from Justinian's codex, its architecture from imperial ambition, its rituals from both pagan grandeur and Christian sanctity. The city was new, but the ghost it hosted was ancient. Constantinople was a mirror of Rome, warped by time, faith. Its walls were taller. Its palaces gleamed brighter. Its Christianity, harder and more political. Where old Rome had walked the delicate line between gods and men, Byzantium fused throne and altar. The emperor was not merely chosen by God, he was his agent on earth. The divine right became divine presence. And yet, beneath the pageantry, the Byzantine experiment wrestled with an ancient question. What is Rome? If not the city on the Tiber? The answer, it seems, was continuity through contradiction. Byzantium thrived by adapting, by clinging to the shape of empire while changing everything inside. Gone were the legions and the senate. In their place stood eunuchs, court intrigue, and cathedrals echoing with liturgical chant. The sword became the cross. The forum became the throne room. And the pantheon's gods gave way to saints framed in Byzantine gold, their eyes unblinking, eternal. No moment defines this metamorphosis more vividly than the reign of Justinian. He was both Caesar and Christ's steward. Under his command, generals like Belisarius clawed back fragments of the lost Western Empire, North Africa, Italy, parts of Spain, as though Rome itself might be reconstructed, piece by crumbling piece. Simultaneously, in the heart of Constantinople, Justinian raised Hagia Sophia, not a basilica of marble alone, but of metaphysical power, a floating dome suspended like heaven above earth. But Justinian's Rome was no longer a republic of men. It was a theocratic dream, ornate, autocratic, sacred, and strange, and still, the name endured. Even as centuries passed and emperors fell, even as the empire shrank under the weight of wars, plague and crusader betrayal, Byzantines clung to their identity, we are Romans. Not out of nostalgia, but because to be Roman was to belong to something greater than nation or language. It was to be a steward of civilization's memory. 1,000 years after Augustus, Rome still ruled, not in legions, but in liturgies, not in bricks, but in ideas. But no dream lasts forever. In 1453, the Ottomans breached Constantinople's great Theodosian walls. Mehmet II, the conqueror, rode through the city not as a barbarian, but as a new Caesar. He ordered his men to spare the dome of Hagia Sophia. He did not tear it down. He converted it. And in doing so, he acknowledged a truth Byzantium had long lived: Rome was not a possession. It was a language of power, and even its enemies spoke it. Even in conquest, Rome survived. And it would continue to echo, not just in Istanbul, but in Moscow, where the Tsars called themselves Caesars, Chars. In Vienna, where the Habsburgs imagined themselves heirs to the empire's ghost. In capitals across Europe, where Roman law underpinned governance, and Roman aesthetics shaped art and order. Byzantium was not just the afterlife of Rome. It was a bridge, a torch carried across the darkness of history, flickering but never extinguished. It gave us an empire that reigned for more than a millennium after the fall of its twin. It gave us visions of divine monarchy and bureaucratic survival. It gave us the knowledge that Rome, for all its collapses, did not vanish. It fractured, it transformed, it multiplied. The empire became a palimpsest, scraped clean, rewritten, layered with new meanings. And in the cracks, the old lines bled through. Because to be Roman, ultimately, was never a matter of birth or borders. It was a state of mind, a symbol, a myth we retell, reshape, and relive, even now, especially now. They wandered among the stones like pilgrims tracing the bones of a saint. The men of the Renaissance did not simply rediscover Rome. They resurrected it, not with incense or ritual, but with marble, pigment, and ink. Their reverence was architectural, their worship expressed in domes and verse. Yet beneath the scaffolding and scholarly treatises pulsed a deeper yearning, not to honor Rome, but to become it. In the cracked arches of the Colosseum, in the silent sentinels of broken aqueducts, they did not see only ruin. They saw promise, a mirror held to human aspiration at its most audacious. Rome was no longer just a city, it was an inheritance. A language of greatness that could be spoken anew through brushstroke, blueprint, and verse. And so Rome rose again, not as empire, but as muse. Filippo Brunelleschi stood in Florence, staring at the Pantheon's shattered legacy. Its dome, the largest of the ancient world, had survived centuries of storms and indifference. He measured its secrets not with tools alone, but with awe. His own dome, rising above Santa Maria del Fiore, was more than engineering. It was invocation, a prayer cast in brick, calling back to Rome's ambition. Michelangelo, carving his David, believed the statue was already inside the stone. That art was a matter of revealing, not creating. In the same way, the Renaissance revealed a Rome still alive in the collective psyche, its veins running through proportion, dignity, and the idea of virtue, that fusion of excellence and fate. But these artists were not naive. They knew that the Rome they loved was built not only on reason and order, but on conquest and spectacle, cruelty and control. And yet, perhaps it was this contradiction that most compelled them. Petrarch wandered the Forum and wept, not out of loss, but out of recognition. He wrote of ruins like old men once powerful, now broken, but still speaking. He listened to the cracked voice of the past and heard a summons. Remember what was possible. Even the popes, those medieval successors of Peter, transformed themselves into Roman emperors with mitres and marble. They commissioned obelisks re-erected, basilicas reborn, avenues laid straight and wide as if Caesar himself had walked them. Rome's spiritual heart now beat in imperial rhythms. The church draped itself in the toga of old empire, building St. Peter's not just as sanctuary, but as throne. Was this reverence, or reinvention, or theft? The Renaissance blurred those lines. To channel Rome was to steal fire from Olympus. And like Prometheus, they burned. Artists were censored, philosophers exiled, Savonarola's bonfires devoured books and paintings alike. But always Rome's flame returned, because the deeper Rome sank into the earth, the more urgently humanity reached down to pull it back up. The Renaissance was not simply a rebirth of Rome. It was a confrontation with it, a reckoning with what had been, and what could be again. A civilization once fallen was now a stage upon which new dramas of genius and hubris would unfold. Yet as marble columns rose beside Renaissance chapels, the tension deepened. How much of Rome could be revived without repeating its downfall? Beneath frescoed ceilings and symmetrical gardens lay a silent question. Does the pursuit of greatness make collapse inevitable? And in that question, Rome remained not just a city or even a civilization, but a mythic threshold, a test every age must face. For the artists and architects of the Renaissance, Rome was not just past. It was the compass of their becoming, and so they built, not to memorialize ruins, but to eclipse them. Not to mourn Rome's fall, but to dare once again to rise. Yet as paint dried on chapel ceilings and columns stood reborn in the plazas of Florence and Rome, another transformation stirred beneath the gilded surface. Quieter, more elusive. It was not merely a revival of form, but a reawakening of identity. The Renaissance did not just reconstruct the body of Rome, it sought to retrieve its soul. And in doing so, it asked, what is glory, if built on ruin? What does it mean to claim the legacy of empire, when that legacy is both luminous and stained? Rome, once the stage for triumphal marches and senatorial decrees, now appeared as an allegory suspended between splendor and sorrow. The humanists who copied Cicero by candlelight, the painters who cast Caesars in the robes of saints. They weren't blind to the irony. They stood at the precipice of greatness and decay, understanding that to imitate Rome was also to risk becoming its echo. And yet they lipped. Raffles, School of Athens, is more than a fresco. It is a séance. Plato and Aristotle walk among figures of reason and revelation, while classical arches frame a new theology of human potential. In that room, under papal commission, ancient philosophy and Christian doctrine do not fight, they commune. The gods are gone, but the gaze of Rome still lingers. This was the Renaissance's double vision: reverence without surrender, ambition tempered by awareness of its costs. Rome became less a place than a mirror held to the ambitions of men who dared to build civilizations again, not from scratch, but from shards. In the shadows of those revivalist domes, another tension flickered: power and pageantry. The Medici commissioned chapels as if their bloodline flowed from Augustus. Venice lifted her palaces on Roman logic and Eastern luxury. Politics masqueraded as piety, and faith wrapped itself in Roman stone. But for all the Renaissance gave back to Rome, it could not restore her innocence. The new architects understood something the Caesars could not: that eternity is not guaranteed, even when carved in marble. That every golden age contains within it the fine dust of its future ruin. And so they embedded warnings in their glory. Skeletons hidden in altarpieces, allegories of vanity beside visions of paradise. Even as they painted the divine, they whispered of mortality. The Renaissance was not a perfect mirror of Rome, but a fractured one. And in each shard, a new truth glinted: civilization is not a single ascent, but a cycle. A song sung again with different notes, by voices forever haunted by what came before. As the sun set behind the hills of Lazio, casting long shadows across the ruins, artists and thinkers did not mourn the fall of Rome. They used it. They needed it. For in its fall they saw a freedom to create not only in memory of greatness, but in defiance of its end. They were not building to last. They were building to remember. In the 20th century, the ghosts of empire stirred again, not in marble halls or manuscript margins, but beneath the banners of steel and rhetoric. The ruins of Rome, once softened by moss and silence, were forced to speak anew, not in whispers of memory, but in the marching chants of fascist ambition. Mussolini did not just invoke Rome. He excavated it, repaved its roads, resurrected its triumphal arches, and renamed its myths. He draped the city in propaganda like armor, a second skin fashioned from ancient glory. The Colosseum was not just a monument, it became a stage. The Forum, not a relic, but a script. Rome was cast as both cradle and crown, the justification for domination, the altar for sacrifice. But beneath the theatrics, something far older was being distorted. For Rome, in its complexity, had always carried contradiction: justice beside brutality, architecture beside ash. The fascist gaze, by contrast, sought only surface. It flattened Rome into iconography. Columns without context, laurel without labor. It turned stone into symbol, and history into myth unbound from consequence. And yet, the power of ruins cannot be controlled so easily. As bulldozers tore through tenement housing to make way for the Via dei Fori Imperiali, meant to mimic the ancient roads of conquest, the bones of the city protested. The foundations of forgotten insulae, homes of the working class, kitchens, courtyards, rose to the surface defiant. Real Rome, lived Rome, refused to stay buried. Here lies the irony. In trying to claim Rome as eternal, fascism revealed its own fragility. Because Rome's endurance does not live in replicas or speeches. It lives in layers, in sediment and smoke, in ruin and reinvention. It lives in contradiction, in the very ambiguity the fascists feared. Mussolini's Rome was a costume, stitched from fragments of empire and fantasy. But the fabric tore easily. When the fascist regime fell, its symbols fell with it, exposed as facades. The myth of empire, when weaponized, collapsed under the weight of its own denial. But Rome did not fall with it. It remained, bruised, yes, and complicated, but unclaimed. Because no ideology can truly possess a city whose soul has survived centuries of fire, plague, betrayal, and rebirth. A city that remembers not just its victories, but its wounds. To walk Rome today is to feel the dissonance of statues once saluted by fascist youth now stand watched by tourists and pigeons. The Via dei Fori, still grand, carries both pride and pain. Shadows fall differently here, cast by both obelisks and memory. Rome teaches us this, that even the darkest appropriations cannot erase the past. They can only echo through it. And those echoes eventually dissolve, leaving behind stone, and story. Walk the streets of modern Rome, and you walk through a palimpsest, a city not just built upon itself, but continuously dreaming itself anew. Here, time does not move in a straight line. It eddies, coils, lingers. A scooter zips past the Pantheon. A priest blesses tourists beneath an Egyptian obelisk. Pigeons roost where emperors once ruled. Past and present do not follow one another. They whisper across the centuries, layered in dust and reverence. This is no longer the Rome of empire. Not the Rome of republic or pope or fascist grandiosity. And yet it is all of them, and more. For in this final threshold moment, we arrive not at a single definition, but at an embrace of multiplicity. Rome endures not because it stayed the same, but because it never did. The eternal city now is a living contradiction, sacred and profane, commercial and contemplative, exhausted and ecstatic. Tourists snap photos of ruins whose meanings they can't name. Lovers drink wine on steps built to glorify gods long silent. Bureaucrats argue policy inside Baroque palaces raised over pagan temples. Each stone is a memory and each memory a mirror. What is it that we see when we look at Rome? A civilization's shadow. A monument to ambition. A cautionary tale. A source code for the West. Perhaps we see ourselves, reflected and refracted through time, our longing for permanence, our fear of decay, our hope that meaning can outlive us, etched into stone or story. The myth of Rome has always been more than the sum of its emperors, its armies, or its architecture. It is a psychic terrain, an idea that civilization itself can be reborn from fire, can remake its gods, can collapse and still echo. The Forum is not a ruin. It is a question. It asks us, what will you build? And what will you leave behind? And that myth has not ended. In literature, in cinema, in marble replicas and imagined empires, Rome lives on, reshaped, reinterpreted, re-inhabited. From Renaissance paintings to video game maps, from political speeches to sacred rites, the city keeps returning, like a ghost that refuses to fade or be exorcised. And in that return lies its power, its eternal recurrence. Because Rome was never just a place. It was always a metaphor, for civilization, for contradiction, for the human soul's wrestle between grandeur and grief. It tells us that no edifice is immortal, but the longing to build something that outlasts us. That is eternal. So the story does not end in ruins. It lives in the questions we continue to ask, about power, about memory, about meaning. What is Rome? Today, it is a crossroads between what was, what is, and what could be. Not an empire, not a city, but a myth still unfolding. In every language, every archive, every heartbeat that pauses before a crumbling arch and feels something ancient stir. Rome survives in us, not in triumph, but in echo, not as blueprint, but as mirror.